When you're young, it's easy to give your heart away.
When she met him, she fell head over heels in love.
But promises of a bright future can be blinding like the sun.
Two of them had handguns, one had a shotgun.
I was begging for our life. Oh my God.
This is not the type of incident that happens every day.
When your vision finally comes into focus, how do you see through the irreparable damage?
He has so much potential and I can't tell you.
She just made a terrible mistake by getting involved with this guy.
I love him, so I feel like I have to protect him.
December 2nd, 2015, Fayetteville, Georgia. Just 3 weeks before Christmas, residents of this quaint Atlanta suburb have settled in for the night.
Fayette County is just south of Atlanta, about a 35-minute drive. It's an area of residential homes with wide open spaces.
It's also a nice area to raise families and just enjoy the quiet side of Atlanta area.
But just past midnight, the calm of Fayetteville is shattered.
A woman named Shirley Rodriguez calls 911 in a panic.
They came in here, 3 guys banged on the door. I went to open the door, and they were masked, and I don't know.
Okay, well, you said they banged on your door and they were wearing masks. What happened? Did they take something? Did they assault?
They came in, they took our TVs, phones. They didn't see mine. And he was pointing the gun at me.
Are you
and
hurt?
my husband.
Are you hurt, ma'am?
Oh, God, no. Just get somebody here, please.
The operator keeps Shirley on the line as Fayette County deputies and investigators race to the home.
Ma'am, how long ago did this happen?
This happened 10 minutes ago. They're gone.
Did they have any weapons that you know of?
Yeah, they were pointing weapons at us.
How many people are there with you, ma'am?
Me, my husband, and my daughter. And they all was pointing guns at every one of us. And I was begging for our life. Oh, my God.
I have help on the way to you, okay?
Fayette County sheriffs and deputies, when they arrived, there was no sign of the people that invaded the house.
There's an initial investigating officer, a uniformed sheriff at this point, and they go and they secure the scene. They talk to the victims, and they get their statements as quickly as they can.
Shirley Rodriguez, her husband John, and Shirley's 18-year-old daughter, Brittany Sharp, are all in shock.
The investigators could clearly see that the family was traumatized and upset about what happened to them.
They were very, very shaken and disturbed.
This is not the type of incident that happens every day. It was traumatic, and the investigators tried to calm them down.
As the family settles down, they slowly tell investigators what happened that night.
John tells the police that him and Shirley were in the bed and a knock happened at the door a little after midnight. So Shirley gets up and goes to the door.
She went to the window, looked out, saw 3 males standing on the porch. 2 of them was wearing a mask. One of the masks was a clown mask, and one of the males was concealing his face with a bandana.
The mother realized something was off, so she did not open the door. She went back and told her husband that there seemed to be somebody on the door trying to play a trick.
As soon as she went back to tell her husband, they kicked the door in.
The 3 men tear into the home.
2 of them had handguns, one had a shotgun. 2 gentlemen went into the room where the mother and father were and held them at gunpoint.
She said that all the males were shouting commands. It was like, give it up, give it to us, or we'll kill you.
One of the guys asked Shirley, where are your cell phones?
And then the other gentleman who had the shotgun went into the daughter's bedroom. He told her to get up out of the bed.
Brittany said that male took her 2 cell phones in her purse.
John says after taking their cell phones, the intruders started ransacking the place.
John said one of the males fired a shot and everything got quiet.
John and Shirley Rodriguez got married in April 2002. And Shirley brought her 2 daughters, Tiffany and Brittany, from her previous marriage into the relationship, making them a family of 4.
Together, they all lived in Stockbridge, Georgia until August 2013, and then they all decided to move to Fayetteville, Georgia. John got a new job as an operations manager at a local trucking company.
By 2013, Tiffany had moved out and started a family of her own. But 18-year-old Brittany was still living with Shirley and John.
Brittany was about to graduate from high school and had dreams of doing something after graduation that will allow her to take care of others.
While Brittany planned for the future, she had the full support of her family.
Even though John wasn't her biological father, she still called him Dad, and he loved that and embraced that with open arms. Together, the Rodriguez family was one big happy family.
But the family's bliss is now overshadowed by a disturbing home invasion. The family tells investigators after they heard the gunshot, they were too afraid to move at first.
The family said when they thought the males had left, they came out of the bedroom.
They immediately noticed personal items all over the place and some electronics missing.
However, they missed Shirley's purse, which contained her phone, and she was able to call the police.
The family says they have no idea who the men were and never saw their faces.
Shirley said the males were at least 6 to 6'4" tall. She said all the males were wearing gloves.
Investigators have a feeling this might not be random.
Police believe that this may have been a personal hit.
December 2nd, 2015, Fayetteville, Georgia. Investigators have been called to the Rodriguez home after 3 masked men broke in and robbed the family at gunpoint.
Police really believe that this crime was personal and it's probably some type of vendetta against his family.
Detectives immediately gather evidence, hoping it will lead to the identities of the 3 men.
Police, where they started processing the scene, there was damage of the door being broke in.
Investigators do find a spent 9mm casing, and it was by the front door where they saw a bullet hole.
In this situation, officers would be looking for anything that the suspect might have touched, anything that they discarded, anything that might have been left at the scene, anything that might lead them in the right direction.
Investigators asked the family for a detailed list of everything taken.
The robbers took 2 TVs, a speaker bar, and a PlayStation, a radio, several cell phones, and a lamp. They also took a trophy, a wallet with multiple credit cards, as well as Brittany's purse.
The total value is just over $3,000. Investigators tell Shirley and John to immediately cancel all their missing credit cards. Officers canvassing the area find their first potential lead.
One of the neighbors did have video surveillance running from their home.
While they download the footage, more leads start coming in.
Within an hour or so, they started getting other information. Mrs. Rodriguez got an alert that her card was trying to be used to buy a gift card on a site called gift.com.
Investigators contacted the website, and they was able to get the IP address of where the attempted purchase was made.
Then detectives discovered that about 2:28 a.m., that someone tried to use John's credit cards at a large retail store. And that was about 20 minutes away from where the crime happened.
Investigators were able to pull the video surveillance from the retail establishment.
There were two girls on video, and they tried to use some of the debit cards from the invasion, and they were all declined.
Who were these women, and what connection do they have to the home invasion?
The video did reveal that when the girls left, they got into a red vehicle.
Even though the license plate was hard to read, investigators put out a bolo to other agencies to be on the lookout for the red vehicle.
They also alert the public that the suspects are armed and dangerous. At the same time, investigators review the footage from the Rodriguez's neighbor's camera.
The investigators are able to see that the red car from the store is the same red car that they see driving through the neighborhood of Shirley and John Rodriguez during the time of the robbery.
And then just before midnight, that red car came into the neighborhood, followed by a silver car.
The two cars drive past the home twice. But investigators still can't make out the license plates.
Investigators see that at 12:07 a.m., the two cars drive straight to the Rodriguez home. And then a few minutes later, they notice that the porch light comes on at the victim's house.
At this point, investigators can see several silhouettes on the front porch, entering and exiting the home.
At 12:14, both cars hightail it out of the neighborhood.
Investigators now believe there are at least 5 to 6 people involved in the home invasion robbery.
Investigators also show the video of the two young women using the stolen credit cards to the Rodriguez family.
They recognize one.
There was a feeling at the time that this occurred that there was a more reckless and disrespectful rise in crimes against people's homes. And in particular, we've had burglaries, but this, when you go into someone's home when they're home and threaten them and do what these people did, that was a line that the community would not tolerate.
Investigators in Fayetteville, Georgia are on the hunt for several people responsible for a home invasion that occurred on December 2nd, 2015 at the Rodriguez home.
Investigators have surveillance footage of a red vehicle then being followed by a silver car. Investigators also see the same red car at a retail store where two black women were seen trying to use the family's stolen credit cards.
When they show the retail store footage to the family, investigators luck out.
Brittany says she recognized one of the females as 22-year-old Ariel Clark.
Born in 1993, Ariel Clark was raised in a close-knit family.
I grew up in Virginia Beach, Virginia. It was just me, my brother, my mom, and my dad.
Ariel was a sweet girl, and everyone who met her loved her. She had a lot of friends.
I was very perky and happy and laughing and goofy all the time, but extremely serious about school at the same time.
Ariel knew exactly what she wanted to do with her life.
I wanted to be a nurse. My mom is a nurse. I spent a lot of time in the hospital because I have sickle cell. I just wanted to take care of other kids with sickle cell and give back to the nurses that helped me.
After Ariel graduated high school, her family relocated to Riverdale, Georgia, just 20 miles north of Fayette County.
I got into Georgia State and I majored in health science. I worked with my mom as a greeter at Piedmont Hospital and just volunteering a lot to see how it is working in a hospital as opposed to being a patient in it.
Ariel spent most of her time at school, the hospital, or with her cousin, Krista Clark Davis.
Me and Krista were always together, going out and hanging out and stuff.
In fact, it was Krista who introduced Ariel to someone special, 17-year-old Kedrick McGee.
We actually met because I called Krista and I needed a ride to go somewhere. So we just got in a car and me and Kedrick sat together and talked nonstop. He was tall and he had nice curly hair and was very charismatic and very, very, very intelligent. And we got along very fast.
He swept Ariel off her feet. She just fell in love, head over heels.
But Ariel's family wasn't so thrilled with how she spent her time, and she decided to make a bold move.
I was young and in love at the time, and I wanted to be out all times of the night, and we were not agreeing on that, so I left.
Ariel bounced around from place to place with her cousin. But one thing she was sure about was her boyfriend.
Kedrick was the first person I felt like I would marry and spend forever with.
After 2 years together, Ariel's future with Kedrick looked bright. But now, the 22-year-old has been identified as one of the women attempting to use the Rodriguez family's stolen credit cards. Brittany tells detectives that she recognizes Ariel because her friend used to date Ariel's boyfriend.
Once investigators find out Ariel's name, they search the database and they find out that she has no criminal history at all.
Investigators wonder if Ariel is also the one trying to buy gift cards online with the stolen credit cards.
Investigators learned the home address associated with the IP address, and that location is 20 minutes from the robbery and about 12 minutes from the retail store.
Just over a week after the home invasion, on December 10th, 2015, detectives head to the address and set up surveillance. Once there, they see something familiar.
In the driveway, they see the same red car that they seen at the robbery and at the store.
When the detectives run the plates of the red car, they find out the vehicle's owner, and it's Ariel Clark.
Then, investigators observe the men leaving the home. They get in the red car and drive off.
On December the 18th, at about 11 a.m., Clayton County Police and Fayette County Sheriff execute a search warrant at that address.
They pretty much recovered, I think, 90% of the items that were taken from the Rodriguez home.
They also find a bandana, which matches what the Rodriguez said one of the robbers wore over his face.
With that information, they obtained an arrest warrant for Ariel.
On January 6, 2016, investigators arrest Ariel at her job and bring her to the police station.
All right. Do you know the reason why you're here today?
One of the first things they asked me was about the credit cards. I found some cards a few weeks ago.
Okay, what kind of cards were they?
I can't even tell you. I just know that
I found her.
Ariel states she found the cards in the parking lot of a retail store and tried to use them there.
Who was with you?
My cousin,
What's her name?
Krista.
The detective confirms the second woman in the retail store surveillance is Ariel's 17-year-old cousin, Krista Clark Davis. But he doesn't buy the rest of her story.
Ariel, I know you're lying. Yes, ma'am. I know where them cards came from. Because evidence doesn't lie. Now's your time to tell me what happened.
On January 6, 2016, the lead detective investigating the terrifying home invasion of the Rodriguez family is questioning 22-year-old Ariel Clark.
Ariel, I know you're lying. You know how I know? I got your car on video because evidence doesn't lie. Now's your time. Now's your time to tell me what happened.
They explain to her that the family is scared, traumatized. They can't sleep at night in their own home due to what happened.
But Ariel still refuses to talk.
I want you to sit there and think about what happened.
At the time, it was very emotional. I guess it's still kind of emotional.
Why don't you just tell me the truth and be honest with me? Tell me what happened.
Ariel finally breaks her silence.
Whose idea was it?
I'm not sure.
Why that house?
I don't know.
I honestly don't know why they chose Brittany's house because of her best friend dating Kedrick. She knew who I was, but I had never seen her before or knew who she was.
Ariel reluctantly admits that she was there and names the 5 other people with her. Ariel says 20-year-old Eugene Gino Butler was driving her red car with another guy she didn't know.
What did he look like?
Just light skin and some dreads.
She says she was in the silver car with her cousin Krista. The car belonged to another one of her cousins, 19-year-old Camry Glassby, who was driving.
Ariel said she was in the backseat with her 19-year-old boyfriend, Kedrick McGee.
Ariel is hesitant to throw her boyfriend under the bus.
He got so much potential and I keep telling him.
Then she drops a bomb.
She says she feels bad because she loves Kedrick and she's about to have his baby.
How far along were you?
I think like 4 or 5 weeks.
I decided to speak with the detective because of me thinking about my child. I didn't want my kid to feel like I put something or someone else above them.
Ariel states that she was hanging out with Krista, Gino, and Kedrick that night, before they met up with Camry and the man she didn't know.
And then, who went to the door?
Kedrick, Gino, and the other person.
Ariel describes Kedrick as wearing a black mask, and she said that Gino was wearing a clown mask with red hair. She said that his friend was wearing a bandana around his face.
After everyone was in the house, Ariel admits that she and her cousin Krista went in.
And then, I was helping take stuff.
She says they put everything in Camry's car.
It was just a bunch of running and screaming, and my heart sank and I felt terrible. To be completely honest, I feel like I kind of blacked out for a moment.
Yeah, it all happened like so fast, and then next thing, like everybody's running to the car.
So you ran back to your car?
Ariel was very naive, and she didn't understand what she was caught up in. She knew that she had probably done wrong by going in there. So she knew that she was in trouble.
Ariel says Krista got in the car with Camry while the rest of them piled in her car.
Ariel says that after the home invasion, they dropped off the stolen items at a friend's house.
Ariel tells the detective that she and Krista then took Kedrick home and went to the store to try and use the stolen credit cards. Oddly, she doesn't mention that someone fired a gun.
But the problem is, the big problem is, who fired that shot? Because that just made it go from here to here. Did you hear it? You don't know who shot?
After that, they arrested me and they locked me up. It was a lot of emotions. I cried a lot.
Investigators believe that she's still not telling the whole story.
Of course, you know, when you love somebody, you want to protect them.
Fayette County investigators have just arrested Ariel Clark after she confessed to helping her boyfriend, Kedrick McGee, the father of her unborn baby, and 4 other people commit a home invasion. They confiscate her phone to track down the others involved.
The investigators needed to verify Ariel's statement, and they also needed the name of the third robber.
Then, on January 11th, 2016, before investigators even reach out to the others, 2 of them call the station.
The investigators then received a call from Ariel's cousins, Krista and Camry, saying that they wanted to come in.
Krista and Camry, they were less forthcoming. They basically denied or played down whatever they knew.
Krista does admit that she was with Ariel at the time that the stolen credit cards were used, so investigators were actually able to use that and charge her with fraud.
Investigators don't have enough to charge Camry and let her go.
And then a couple hours later, after the police interviewed her, her mom called and said, "Camry wants to talk to you again."
Camry tells a similar story to Ariel's. She admits she was with Ariel, Kedrick, Gino, and Krista, but she doesn't know who the third guy was either.
There was some discrepancy about who was in which car, but ultimately it was pretty clear that the boys went to the home together in the red car, girls went to the home in the gray car.
That's when Camry says she saw them get out with masks on and realized what was about to happen.
She really did not want to be there. She actually tried to drive away, and Kedrick stopped her and said, "Don't go anywhere."
But Camry says she was too far away to really see anything.
Camry said she heard a loud noise and she assumed that they kicked in the door. And she heard someone yelling and screaming. And then they came out and they put all the stuff in her car.
And then they told us to hurry up and drive. We had drove off and I just heard gunshots and I got like super scared.
The next day, after spending a night in jail, Krista decides to come clean too.
I did not go in the house at all. That's the thing I did. I didn't go in the house. They said to come at the bottom of the steps, and then they started handing me the stuff.
But Krista admits that Kedrick may have been the one with the itchy trigger finger.
Like, when the gunshot happened, like, it was nobody in the house. It was only Kedrick in here.
So Kedrick fired the shot?
And then they drove off, and then Kedrick caught up with them.
She said Kedrick threatened everyone to keep their mouth shut.
Why that house? Did he ever say why that house?
Mm-mm.
Although the third man remains a mystery, with the two girls verifying Ariel's statement and filling in some holes, police now have enough for arrest warrants for Gino and Kedrick. With the help of the Marshals' fugitive task force, 2 days later, they find them both. The detective speaks with Kedrick first.
Did you have anything to do with that? You need to tell me now.
I think I'll speak to a lawyer.
With Kedrick refusing to talk, the detective hopes Gino will be more cooperative.
Eugene started out with, I don't know what you're talking about. I don't remember that. What day was it? And those sorts of things.
After realizing the serious trouble he's in, Gino tells the detective that it was all Kedrick's idea.
He was like, I'm about to go hit Brittany Huff and all this stuff.
Why did he pick Brittany?
Gino tells the detective that Kedrick used to date Brittany's friend.
I guess he don't like them. Like, they got problems going on.
Gino said that he did not want to do the home invasion.
So I assumed they were going to take me home, but they ain't take me home.
His story of how he ended up at the house is also like the girls. But he gives investigators a gift: the identity of the mysterious third man.
They had went to go pick up the other dude.
What's his name again?
Amarius Westmoreland.
Gino tells the investigators that the third person was their 17-year-old cousin, Amarius Westmoreland.
What did Amarius say?
He agreed with it. He's sorry.
Gino tells the detective that after they drove to the house, he felt pressured to go in. Gino claims that Kedrick gave him the clown mask, the gloves, and a gun from his trunk.
I kept
Ariel saw a lot of potential in Kedrick. Once she became pregnant by him, she felt it was a sense of loyalty to continue to support him with his visions and his dreams for them. Her being pregnant by him can draw a lot of different emotions that can cause her to possibly be swayed in a lot of different areas. So a lot of times people think they're in love, but really it's the luminance of love.
January 2016, Fayetteville, Georgia. Ariel Clark's boyfriend, Kedrick McGee, and Eugene Gino Butler have both been arrested for the home invasion of the Rodriguez family. Gino comes clean to investigators about what happened that night.
Ultimately, it was Eugene's version that made the most sense, chronologically and proximately.
What kind of gun did you have?
He says he and Kedrick had handguns, and Amarius had a shotgun.
Amarius, like, he knocked on the door and all that stuff, and that's when Kedrick had kicked in the door and had ran in there.
Gino said that he followed Kedrick into the bedroom of the parents, and that Kedrick pointed the gun at both of them.
But he was like, get down, don't move.
Gino tells the detectives that Amarius went into Brittany's room with the gun. He pointed the gun at her and took her phone and her purse.
Gino confirms that both Ariel and Krista went into the home. After they put all the stuff in Camry's car, he also confirms that Kedrick fired the gun.
He was still in the house?
By his stuff he had shot, then he had ran.
With Gino's statement added to Krista and Camry's, it's clear to investigators that although Ariel confessed, she still tried to shield her boyfriend.
She didn't admit that he had a gun on him. She acted like she didn't see him break the door in. She left out that it was his idea and he was the one that fired the gun. She seems to still be protecting him.
She still maintained a loyalty. That's why she did not tell and disclose that her boyfriend was the one that actually shot the gun.
I love him and I don't want him to get in any trouble. So I feel like I have to protect him.
On January 19th, 2016, police find Amarius Westmoreland and bring him in.
Amarius' statements were, I was just along for the ride. I didn't really know what they were doing. And ultimately, he agreed that he did it.
With the last one in custody, investigators charge all 6.
Ultimately, they were all charged with armed robbery, all charged with aggravated assault, all charged with credit card fraud, and all charged with burglary.
The 3 guys are also charged with possession of a firearm during a crime.
The Rodriguez family was so relieved when they found out that they had been arrested. They felt like justice had finally been served.
Despite their ages, if convicted, they all face serious time.
Me loving him as much as I do, I felt like I had to be there to make sure that bad doesn't go to worse. In my mind, I felt like somehow I could stop things or prevent it from being even more complete chaos.
Instead of going to trial, Ariel decides to make a deal and pleads guilty to burglary.
It was a 10-5 where I would have 5 years to spend in the prison and then 10 years on probation.
I was able to convince the prosecutor that she was more of a victim than she was a defendant in this case, that she was caught up with a boyfriend who was running with some bad people.
The others decide to make deals as well. Krista receives the same sentence as Ariel, but Camry's charges are dropped.
Camry, who we decided to dismiss all the charges against because she really was called in completely after the fact. She did not go in.
Instead, she pleads guilty to making a false statement to police and receives 3 years probation. The boys don't get off so easy.
Kedrick McGee ultimately pled to an armed robbery, followed by 10 more years for aggravated assault, followed then by 10 years of probation for participating in the credit card fraud. He's currently still serving his sentence.
Eugene and Amarius also received 20 years, plus 10 years probation.
They did not plead to armed robbery. They pled to aggravated assault and burglary, as well as the theft charges, which means they are eligible for parole much sooner than Kedrick is.
However, nothing can take away the terror and the anguish that this family experienced in their own home. Your home is your safe space.
In 2018, Ariel was released.
I ended up doing about 3.5 years in the prison, and then I got out on parole in August 2018. I am still currently on probation. I was released when my daughter was going on 2 years old. It was an amazing feeling. If I could do all of this all over again, I would just make sure that I have it in my hand.
The rain in Seattle does not merely fall, it buries. It washes over the neon-lit concrete, pooling in the dark, oil-slicked alleys of Pioneer Square, carrying the deepest, most horrific secrets of the Pacific Northwest down into the black, suffocating waters of Puget Sound. For over 3 decades, one such secret lay submerged beneath the layers of damp earth, forgotten evidence lockers, and frozen police archives, a freezing shadow known to cold case investigators only as the ultimate dead end. It was the winter of 1991 when the music of the city was loud. Grunge was exploding through the smoke-filled underground clubs, and the screams of a young woman were completely swallowed by the howling, relentless wind. Her name was Evelyn Vance, a 24-year-old artist whose life was violently, systematically stolen in a crime so brutal, so calculated, that it left an entire community paralyzed with fear and paranoia. The headlines back then screamed of a monster in the mist, a phantom who struck without leaving a single trace, turning a vibrant, artistic neighborhood into a hunting ground. But as the weeks bled into months, and the months hardened into decades, the screaming headlines faded into a whisper, and the thick file was stamped with the most frustrating, agonizing words in law enforcement: cold case. For 35 years, the file gathered dust, a monument to human failure and investigative VTAC, until a breakthrough so sudden, so utterly microscopic, shattered the silence and exposed a labyrinth of deception that no one, not even the most hardened homicide detectives, could have ever anticipated. To understand the sheer magnitude of the shockwave that hit the city, one must return to the freezing morning of November 14, 1991, inside a cramped, third-floor apartment overlooking the gray, fog-choked docks. Evelyn's sister, Sarah, had been trying to reach her for 2 days, her phone calls bouncing into an empty, ringing void that filled her with a growing, icy dread. When the landlord finally turned the heavy brass key and pushed the thick wooden door open, the smell hit them first, a metallic, copper stench of stagnant blood that stained the back of the throat and lingered for weeks. Inside, the apartment was a chaotic, horrifying canvas of violence. Evelyn lay near her easel, her lifeblood pooled across the hardwood floor, her eyes staring blankly at the ceiling as if still projecting the final, terrifying image of her attacker. There was no forced entry, no signs of a robbery, and absolutely no defensive wounds that suggested a prolonged struggle. The killer had moved like a ghost, striking with surgical precision before vanishing into the rain-slicked streets of Seattle. The initial investigation was a frenzy of flashing blue lights, yellow police tape fluttering in the wind, and desperate neighborhood canvases. Detectives combed through Evelyn's life, interviewing ex-boyfriends, colleagues, and strange patrons from the gallery where she worked, but every path led to a brick wall. The DNA technology of 1991 was rudimentary, a primitive tool incapable of extracting a usable profile from the minuscule biological droplets left at the scene, leaving the authorities with nothing but questions and a rapidly cooling trail. As the years rolled on, the phantom of 1991 became an urban myth, a cautionary tale whispered by elders to warn young women about the dangers of the city after dark. The Vance family disintegrated under the weight of the unsolved tragedy, their holidays marked by an empty chair, a profound, agonizing silence, and a deep-seated resentment toward the police. Every anniversary, a lone detective would open the thick manila folder, staring at the glossy crime scene photographs, searching for a pattern, a missed detail, a single thread to pull. But the city was changing. High-tech glass towers replaced the gritty brick facades, and the analog world of the early 90s dissolved into the digital age. The killer, it seemed, had won, escaping into the crowd, living a life of freedom, breathing the crisp mountain air, while Evelyn remained trapped in the permanent amber of her final, agonizing moments. Then the year 2026 arrived, bringing with it an advanced era of genetic genealogy and forensic science that could essentially resurrect the dead. A new generation of investigators, armed with tools that seemed like pure science fiction in 1991, decided to take one last look into the darkness of the Vance file. They pulled the old evidence bags from the climate-controlled vaults, targeting a single, microscopic biological sample that had been preserved on a torn piece of fabric from the victim's clothing. They didn't know it yet, but they were about to trigger a forensic earthquake. When the laboratory technicians ran the degraded sample through the modern high-density DNA sequencing matrices, the computer didn't just find a match. It threw a chaotic, impossible curveball that sent shockwaves through the entire department. The genetic profile pointed directly to a man named Arthur Pendleton, a respectable, 64-year-old accountant living a quiet, suburban life in the outskirts of Bellevue. To the community, Arthur was a pillar of stability, a gentle family man who volunteered at the local library and spent his weekends tending to his pristine rose garden. The news of his impending arrest spread through the precinct like wildfire. A 1991 cold case finally solved, a monster unmasked after 35 years of hiding in plain sight. On a crisp autumn morning, a fleet of unmarked police cruisers surrounded Arthur's manicured property, tactically positioning themselves to cut off any escape route. When the detectives knocked on the front door, Arthur answered in his bathrobe, his expression shifting from mild confusion to utter terror as the handcuffs clicked around his wrists. The neighborhood watched in collective shock as the old man was led down the driveway, the flashing red and blue lights reflecting off the windows of the homes he had lived near for decades. The community was convinced the nightmare was over, that justice had finally caught up with the ghost of Pioneer Square. But inside the sterile, fluorescent-lit walls of the interrogation room, the narrative didn't fracture. It multiplied. As the lead detective slammed the case file down on the metal table, presenting the undeniable, absolute DNA match, Arthur Pendleton did not weep, nor did he confess. Instead, a chilling, surreal smile crept across his face, and he uttered a phrase that instantly froze the blood of everyone watching behind the two-way mirror. "You have the right code," Arthur whispered, his voice steady. "But you have the wrong man." It was in that exact, breathless moment of realization that the detectives remembered a critical, terrifying detail buried deep within Arthur's background files, a detail that turned a routine arrest into a psychological hall of mirrors. Arthur Pendleton had a twin brother, an identical twin brother named Thomas Pendleton, from whom he had been completely estranged since the winter of 1991. Because they were identical twins, developed from a single fertilized egg, they shared the exact same genetic blueprint, possessing DNA profiles so perfectly identical that standard forensic testing could not tell them apart. The breakthrough that was supposed to solve the case had instead created a monstrous legal paradox. The science proved beyond a shadow of a doubt that a Pendleton was the killer, but it could not tell the law which twin had held the knife. The air inside the precinct grew thick, heavy with the weight of an unprecedented crisis. Homicide veterans who thought they had seen every trick in the book stood frozen, staring at the monitors. The DNA evidence, the gold standard of modern justice, the ultimate weapon of the prosecution, had been rendered completely useless. It pointed a finger at two distinct human beings simultaneously, effectively accusing both while proving the guilt of neither in a court of law. If they prosecuted Arthur, his defense team would simply point to Thomas and create an insurmountable wall of reasonable doubt. If they went after Thomas, Arthur's quiet, spotless life would be used as a shield to claim Thomas was being framed by circumstantial bias. The legal machinery of the state was paralyzed, jammed by a biological anomaly that seemed deliberately engineered to mock the concept of justice. Every clock in the room seemed to tick louder, counting down the hours they could legally hold Arthur before the lack of specific, individualized evidence forced them to let him walk right out the front door. Outside the station, the media circus was already intensifying. Satellite trucks lined the curbs, their massive dishes pointing toward the sky, broadcasting the sensational headline to a hungry public: Seattle 1991 cold case solved. Identical twins arrest exposes decades of lies. But the public did not yet know the dark twist that was unfolding behind the locked doors of the interrogation wing. They did not know that the police were currently trapped in a biological labyrinth, desperately trying to find a way to separate one man into two, to find the microscopic dividing line between an innocent citizen and a ruthless killer who shared the same face, the same eyes, and the same blood. The shadow of Evelyn Vance seemed to hang over the room, demanding answers that science had promised to deliver, but had instead complicated beyond human comprehension. The detectives knew that if they failed to break this paradox now, the case would not just go cold again. It would become a permanent, mocking monument to a killer's ultimate victory over the law. The revelation hit the homicide unit like a physical blow, converting a moment of absolute triumph into an immediate, unprecedented crisis. The legal system was designed for clarity, for a singular thread connecting a specific suspect to a specific crime scene, but the Pendleton twins had effectively weaponized their own biology against the machinery of justice. Detectives suddenly found themselves staring at two identical faces, two identical sets of fingerprints, and a shared genetic code that pointed to both and neither at the exact same time. The investigation had to be violently restarted from scratch, shifting away from the laboratory and back onto the wet pavement, digging into the fractured history of two brothers who had spent the last 35 years executing a masterclass in deception. Thomas Pendleton, the twin brother, was located living 300 miles away in a remote coastal town in Oregon, working as a secluded carpenter, away from the digital grid, away from the eyes of society. When the police arrived at his isolated cabin, Thomas didn't run. He sat on his porch, watched the cruisers pull up, and lit a cigarette, his face a perfect, haunting carbon copy of the man currently sitting in a jail cell in Seattle. The air between the two states was thick with tension as investigators realized they were dealing with a decades-long game of psychological chess, where every move had been anticipated by a pair of brilliant, twisted minds. To understand the depth of the deception, the Cold Case Task Force had to immerse themselves in the year 1991, reconstructing the movements, the relationships, and the psychological profiles of Arthur and Thomas when they were young, volatile men in their late 20s. In the early 90s, the twins were inseparable, a dark, charismatic duo who frequented the same artsy circles in Seattle, moving through the underground scene like a single entity. They dressed identically, shared an apartment, and, according to old acquaintances, took a sadistic pleasure in swapping identities to deceive employers, landlords, and romantic partners. They had transformed their genetic identicality into an alibi machine, a way to move through the world without ever facing the consequences of their actions. Evelyn Vance had crossed their path during an art exhibition in the summer of 1991, drawing the attention of both brothers, sparking a toxic, competitive obsession that would ultimately seal her fate. The records showed that in the weeks leading up to her murder, Evelyn had grown increasingly paranoid, telling her sister that she felt like she was being watched by a man who seemed to be in two places at once, a man whose eyes shifted from warmth to absolute malice from one day to the next. She didn't realize she wasn't dealing with one stalker, but a coordinated tag team of psychological terror. The interrogation of Arthur Pendleton continued for hours, a grueling war of attrition under the harsh lights. The seasoned detectives tried every psychological tactic in the book, attempting to exploit the natural rivalries that often exist between identical twins, trying to get Arthur to break and point the finger at Thomas. But Arthur remained an impenetrable fortress of calm, his demeanor that of a man who knew the law was completely powerless against his biological shield. He claimed that on the night of November 14, 1991, he was miles away, sleeping off a heavy drinking bout in a motel room, but when asked if his brother could verify that, he simply smiled and suggested they ask Thomas themselves. Meanwhile, in Oregon, Thomas was subjected to the same intense scrutiny by local authorities working in tandem with the Seattle PD. Thomas's story was a terrifyingly mirrored reflection of Arthur's. He claimed he was the one with the alibi, that he had spent that fatal night working late at a warehouse, and that Arthur had been the one obsessed with Evelyn Vance. Each brother painted the other as the monster, creating an agonizing loop of mutual accusation that left the prosecution with a legal nightmare. If they charged Arthur, the defense would simply argue it was Thomas, and if they charged Thomas, the defense would blame Arthur, leading to a guaranteed, reasonable doubt for both. The community of Seattle watched the unfolding legal drama with a mixture of morbid fascination and absolute horror. The news that a cold case had been solved only to be trapped in an identical twin paradox dominated every television screen and digital feed. Talk radio hosts debated the ethics of the case, legal experts argued over the precedents, and the family of Evelyn Vance found themselves plunged into a fresh, even more agonizing circle of hell. They were so close to the truth, so close to seeing the man who destroyed their lives face justice, yet they were separated from that justice by a freak occurrence of nature. The internet erupted with amateur sleuths trying to dissect old photographs of the twins from 1991, looking for a mole, a scar, a slight variation in posture, anything that could differentiate the two men. But the twins had been meticulous. They had spent their entire lives ensuring that no such distinctions existed. Even their medical records from the 90s were a chaotic mess of overlapping appointments and shared insurance claims, suggesting that they had actively traded places even during doctor visits, creating a medical smokescreen that made it impossible to determine who suffered from what ailment or injury. As the days turned into weeks, the pressure on the Seattle Homicide Department reached a breaking point. They could not hold Arthur Pendleton indefinitely without formal charges that could withstand a grand jury's scrutiny, and they could not arrest Thomas without more definitive proof. The case was on the verge of collapsing back into the icy void of the unsolved, a catastrophic failure that would allow a killer to walk free forever simply because he had a brother who looked exactly like him. The lead detectives knew that standard police work had failed. They needed something revolutionary, something that went beyond the boundaries of traditional forensics. They reached out to elite international research institutes, contacting geneticists who were operating at the absolute cutting edge of epigenetic sequencing, a highly specialized field that looks not at the DNA sequence itself, but at the microscopic chemical tags that attach to the DNA over time due to environmental factors, diet, stress, and lifestyle choices. It was a desperate, multi-million-dollar gamble, a scientific Hail Mary to see if the lives the two brothers lived after 1991 had left a distinct, indelible signature on their respective cellular structures that could finally break the twin paradox. The task force set up a war room dedicated solely to mapping the post-1991 timelines of the brothers, transforming a standard police office into an archive of two fractured lives. Every credit card swipe, every traffic ticket, every tax filing from the last 35 years was printed out and pinned to massive corkboards, creating two parallel lines that stretched across the room. Detectives pulled old utility bills from the early 90s, trying to determine if one brother used more electricity or water while the other was allegedly out of town. They interviewed landlords from forgotten buildings, digging up 30-year-old memories of the two strange men who looked like one. But the deeper they dug, the more they realized how deeply ingrained the deception truly was. Neighbors from their old apartment building recalled that the brothers often wore the exact same clothes on alternating days, intentionally leaving a confusing trail of impressions. One day he was polite. The next day he would look right through you, one elderly witness recalled. The police weren't just fighting a lack of evidence. They were fighting a brilliant, lifelong performance art piece designed to commit the perfect murder and leave the justice system completely blind. The search for the epigenetic differentiator quickly became a frantic race against a ticking legal clock, transforming into a high-stakes scientific thriller unfolding inside the secure, restricted laboratories of the University of Washington. While the geneticists extracted fresh, untainted blood samples from both Arthur and Thomas Pendleton under strict legal supervision, a specialized team of digital forensics experts and cold case investigators began a grueling forensic autopsy of the twins' lives post-1991. They desperately needed to find a divergence, a profound moment where the two identical biological paths split into radically different terrains, because they knew that this exact divergence would be reflected in their epigenomes. If one brother had smoked heavily for 30 years while the other maintained clean lungs, if one had suffered a specific, rare viral infection, or if one had worked in an industrial environment heavy with volatile chemical toxins, those specific life experiences would leave microscopic chemical flags, known as methyl groups, permanently attached to specific parts of their DNA architecture. The detectives began digging through 3 decades of tax returns, employment records, international travel logs, and microscopic credit card statements, building a massive, parallel timeline of the two men's lives. They discovered that shortly after Evelyn Vance's brutal murder, the brothers had experienced a violent, earth-shattering falling out, an explosive argument witnessed by a terrified neighbor who claimed she heard glass shattering through the thin walls and one of the twins screaming, "You ruined everything. Now we both have to live in hell." Following that fateful night, The twins parted ways immediately, initiating a decades-long silence that was only broken when the police knocked on their respective doors 35 years later. Arthur Pendleton had chosen the path of hyperconformity, burying himself in the mundane, predictable rhythm of corporate accounting and quiet suburban domesticity, as if trying to wash away a pitch-black past with a torrential flood of middle-class respectability. He married a woman from a prominent family, raised 2 children, and became intensely obsessed with health and longevity, maintaining a strict organic diet, avoiding alcohol entirely, and following a rigorous, unyielding daily exercise regimen. Thomas, on the other hand, had plunged headfirst into a self-destructive spiral of isolation and transient living. He drifted through brutal logging camps, remote fishing vessels, and weathered coastal towns in Oregon, his physical body subjected to the harsh, unforgiving elements of the Pacific Northwest and the heavy chemical toll of chronic, severe alcohol consumption. The detectives realized that these 2 drastically different lifestyles were exactly what the epigeneticists needed to break the deadlock. If the cutting-edge science worked, the chemical tags on Thomas's DNA would look like a weathered, storm-beaten map of trauma, while Arthur's would resemble a clean, manicured garden. But the fundamental, terrifying question remained: which of these 2 lifestyles belonged to the man who had stood in Evelyn Vance's apartment on that bloody night in 1991? Did the killer flee into suburban obscurity to hide his guilt behind a white picket fence, or did the crushing guilt consume him from within, driving him into the lonely, booze-soaked isolation of the rugged Oregon coast? Back in the interrogation room, the psychological warfare intensified to a suffocating degree. The lead detectives decided to play a highly dangerous, manipulative game, confronting Arthur with the grim details of his brother's ruined life, trying to provoke a reaction of either superiority, pity, or hidden anger. They showed Arthur high-resolution photographs of Thomas's rundown, isolated cabin, his weathered, prematurely aged face, and his trembling, calloused hands. For a fleeting, breathless second, Arthur's mask of absolute, professional calm slipped. A flash of raw, unfiltered contempt danced in his eyes, a look of pure, narcissistic arrogance that absolutely did not belong to a gentle suburban accountant. "Thomas always was weak," Arthur muttered, his voice dropping an octave, completely losing its soft, polite edge. He never could handle the pressure. He let the rain get inside his head. The detective leaned forward across the metal table, his heart hammering violently against his ribs, sensing they were finally close to a psychological fracture. "What pressure, Arthur?" "The pressure of what you 2 did to Evelyn." But just as quickly as it had appeared, the mask snapped back into place with terrifying efficiency. Arthur retracted his hands, crossed his arms tightly, and went completely silent, refusing to say another word without his high-priced defense attorney present. The psychological crack had shown them the monster hiding within, but it still hadn't given them the hard, physical evidence they could take to a judge to secure a conviction. Meanwhile, the parallel investigation into the gritty 1991 crime scene itself was yielding strange, retrospective clues when viewed through the unique lens of the twin dynamic. Reviewing the original, yellowed handwritten notes of the first responders, detectives found a brief statement from a passing witness who had seen a man matching the twins' general description running frantically from the apartment building on the night of the murder. The witness had explicitly noted that the fleeing man was running with a distinct, noticeable limp, heavily favoring his left leg as he vanished into the dark mist. The original 1991 investigators had checked both Arthur and Thomas for visible injuries days after the murder, but both brothers had presented pristine physical profiles with absolutely no signs of trauma, bruising, or limping. The modern cold case team realized that this was another piece of their brilliant identity-swapping puzzle. If one brother had been injured during a violent struggle with Evelyn, they could have easily switched places during the police interview process, allowing the uninjured brother to present himself to detectives as the primary suspect while the injured one hid out safely in their shared apartment. To prove this theory, investigators needed to find medical records or physical evidence of a hidden injury from 35 years ago, a task that seemed almost entirely impossible given the passage of time and the destruction of old analog hospital archives. Then, an unexpected breakthrough came from a dusty, forgotten source, an old, moldering box of family photographs discovered in the damp attic of the twins' deceased mother. The photos were a chronological record of their childhood and volatile youth, a visual timeline of two boys who looked like carbon copies of one another. But as the detectives scanned the photos from the late 80s and early 90s using high-resolution digital forensic scanners, they noticed something peculiar in a candid snapshot taken just 2 weeks before Evelyn's murder. It was a photo of the brothers at a chaotic backyard barbecue. One brother was wearing a distinctive, heavy silver watch with a noticeably cracked glass face, and on his bare left knee was a small, uniquely shaped, white jagged scar from an old childhood bicycle accident. The other brother, wearing a black leather jacket, had absolutely no such scar on his knee and was wearing a thick gold ring on his right hand. The cold case team frantically cross-referenced this visual evidence with the 1991 police interview notes and discovered a shocking detail. The brother, who had come into the precinct for questioning, identifying himself firmly as Arthur, had been wearing that exact gold ring. The jigsaw puzzle pieces were beginning to spin in the darkness, but they were still floating in a sea of legal uncertainty, waiting for the definitive, hammer blow of the epigenetic lab results to pin the correct, murderous identity to the killer once and for all. The atmosphere inside the forensics laboratory was suffocatingly tense as the final data from the intensive epigenetic sequencing matrix began to render on the high-definition monitors. For 72 hours straight, the geneticists had focused their entire scientific arsenal on a highly specific, cutting-edge phenomenon known as differentially methylated regions, DMRs, meticulously analyzing over 850,000 individual methylation sites across the entire genomes of both Arthur and Thomas Pendleton. The results appearing on the screens were a spectacular, complex, and colorful display of data points that clearly, undeniably illustrated the radical divergence of their adult lives. The two genetic profiles were no longer identical. They were now as distinct as two entirely different planets. Thomas's profile showed massive, undeniable chemical alterations in specific genes associated with long-term alcohol metabolism and chronic, high-level psychological stress, a biological testament to his decades of hard, destructive living on the stormy Oregon coast. Arthur's profile, conversely, showed exceptionally high levels of methylation in genes related to cardiovascular health and metabolic regulation, perfectly consistent with his intense, lifelong fitness regime and pristine diet. The science had successfully separated the twins on a deep, cellular level, creating two distinct biological entities that the modern legal system could finally recognize as individuals. But the ultimate, terrifying hurdle remained. The original 1991 DNA sample recovered from Evelyn Vance's clothing was far too small and too heavily degraded to undergo this advanced, high-density epigenetic testing. The modern science could effortlessly tell the brothers apart today, but it could not directly test the ancient, 35-year-old evidence to see which specific lifestyle matched the killer's profile back in the winter of 1991. The prosecutors were absolutely devastated by this cruel scientific limitation. They possessed a revolutionary way to differentiate the two men in the present day, but they still lacked the definitive, physical bridge to connect that modern difference directly to the bloody past. The lead detective, refusing to allow the case to collapse back into the shadows, realized that if they couldn't bring the 1991 evidence into the modern laboratory, they had to bring the modern suspects back to 1991. They launched a massive, highly covert operation to reconstruct the twins' financial, professional, and physical movements during the exact week of the murder, searching frantically for a single digital or physical footprint that had been overlooked by the original task force. They assigned an elite team to comb through the deep, dusty microfiche archives of old Seattle bank records, looking for ATM transactions, credit card receipts, or gas station logs from mid-November 1991. After days of mind-numbing research in the dark basement of the records department, they found a phantom transaction, an ATM withdrawal made at a bank terminal just 3 blocks from Evelyn Vance's apartment building, occurring exactly 45 minutes after the medical examiner's estimated time of her death. The bank card used belonged to a rare, shared checking account held jointly by both Arthur and Thomas Pendleton. The transaction security camera film had long since been destroyed, but the ancient bank ledger recorded a critical, heart-stopping detail. The withdrawal was for $40, and it was immediately followed by a second, failed attempt to withdraw an additional $100 due to sudden, insufficient funds. This financial footprint completely changed the trajectory of the investigation. The detectives knew from the original 1991 case file that Evelyn's wallet had been found open on her counter, her cash stolen, but her credit cards left completely untouched, a detail that had initially led investigators to falsely suspect a random robbery gone wrong. Now, they had a new, deeply sinister interpretation. The killer had run out of money, committed the brutal murder, stolen Evelyn's cash, and then immediately ran to the nearest ATM to combine her stolen money with their own meager funds to either flee the area or buy something incredibly urgent. The fact that the account was shared meant that legally either brother could have physically used the card, but the failed second transaction suggested a profound state of panic, a frantic, desperate pressing of buttons by someone whose hands were shaking violently with adrenaline and covered in invisible blood. The team needed to know exactly who was in extreme financial distress in November 1991. They dug significantly deeper into the brothers' past, uncovering old, forgotten pawn shop logs from the wider King County area. They discovered that just 3 days before the murder, Thomas Pendleton had pawned a highly valuable, vintage acoustic guitar, claiming to the shop owner that he desperately needed quick cash to pay off a dangerous gambling debt. Arthur, meanwhile, had a steady, well-paying job at a local print shop and a perfectly stable, growing bank balance, suggesting that he had absolutely no immediate need for petty cash or a desperate, midnight ATM withdrawal. The circle of suspicion was tightening rapidly around Thomas, but the veteran detectives knew that circumstantial financial distress was simply not enough to secure a conviction in a high-profile, historic cold case trial. They needed a direct, undeniable physical link that bypassed the genetic twin paradox entirely. They went back to the childhood photograph showing the unique, jagged scar on the left knee of the brother wearing the silver watch. They needed to determine, with absolute medical certainty, which brother possessed that exact scar on his body today. They obtained a highly restricted federal warrant for a full, comprehensive physical examination of both Arthur and Thomas Pendleton. When the medical examiner forced Arthur to roll up his trousers in the Bellevue holding cell, his left knee was completely smooth, entirely devoid of any significant scarring or historical trauma. But when the medical team examined Thomas in the remote coastal town in Oregon, they found a faint, jagged, silver line running directly across his left patella, the exact, identical match to the childhood bicycle accident visible in the 1991 photograph. The brother with the scar was Thomas. The brother who had been seen running with a distinct limp from Evelyn's apartment building, favoring his left leg after a violent, life-or-death struggle, was undeniably Thomas. The fragmented pieces of the puzzle were violently, perfectly locking into place, revealing a decades-long conspiracy of silence and identity fraud that was finally about to unravel in spectacular fashion. Armed with this new, devastating matrix of physical, financial, and photographic evidence, the Seattle detectives boarded a flight back to Oregon to confront Thomas Pendleton one final time. They didn't bring the complex DNA charts or the confusing epigenetic data. They brought the childhood photographs, the pawn shop receipts, the bank ledgers, and the medical reports detailing the unmistakable scar on his knee. They walked into the local sheriff's office where Thomas was being held under tight security, slamming the evidence down on the heavy wooden table with a force that echoed through the small, quiet building. "The game is officially over, Thomas," the lead detective said, his voice cold, sharp, and entirely unwavering. "We know about the switch. We know you were the one who limped out of that building in 1991. We know you used Arthur's pristine identity to confuse the original investigators, and we know you've been running from this nightmare ever since. Your brother isn't going to prison for you, and the modern science just completely stripped away your biological hiding place." Thomas stared down at the photograph of himself as a young boy, his eyes tracking the faint silver line on his knee, his breath catching sharply in his throat as the reality of his situation finally crushed his decades of defiance. The silence in the interrogation room became heavy, suffocating, as the phantom of 1991 prepared to finally speak. The silence inside the small Oregon interrogation room stretched until it became a physical weight, the air thick with the realization that 35 years of deception were collapsing into a single, inescapable point of time. Thomas Pendleton's gaze remained locked on the childhood photograph, his fingers trembling slightly as he reached out to touch the glossy surface, tracing the image of a life he had violently discarded 3 decades ago. When he finally lifted his head, the arrogance that had defined his demeanor was completely gone, replaced by the hollow, haunted look of a man who had been running from a ghost for his entire adult life. "We thought we were geniuses," Thomas whispered, his voice cracked and raspy, barely audible over the hum of the overhead fluorescent lights. "We thought we had written the perfect script. A crime with 2 actors, but only 1 character." The detective didn't interrupt, remaining perfectly still, allowing the camera to record every syllable of a confession that would soon send shockwaves through the entire legal landscape of the Pacific Northwest. Thomas began to recount the events of November 14, 1991, describing a night of dark obsession that had spun completely out of control. He confessed that his infatuation with Evelyn Vance had turned into a toxic, possessive madness. He had followed her to her apartment that evening, gaining entry under the pretense of delivering an urgent message from his brother Arthur, whom Evelyn trusted. Once inside, a violent argument erupted when Evelyn realized Thomas's sinister intentions and demanded he leave immediately. In a fit of explosive, unbridled rage, Thomas had attacked her, his hands striking with a lethal force that silenced her cries forever. During the frantic struggle, Evelyn had fought back with a desperate, dying strength, kicking Thomas hard in his left knee, tearing the cartilage and causing an excruciating, blinding pain that caused him to stumble and limp heavily as he fled the scene of the slaughter. Panic-stricken and bleeding from minor scratches, Thomas had crawled back to the apartment he shared with Arthur, collapsing on the floor and confessing the horrific truth to his identical mirror image. What followed was a chilling testament to the twisted, codependent bond of the identical twins. Instead of calling the police, Arthur, driven by a misplaced sense of family loyalty and a terrifyingly cold logic, devised a plan to exploit their genetic identicality to create an impenetrable wall of confusion for the authorities. They knew that the police would eventually come looking for a man matching their description, so they decided to merge their identities into a single, confusing blur. Arthur, who was completely uninjured and calm, would be the one to face the initial police inquiries, presenting himself as the cooperative, innocent brother who had an ironclad alibi for the night of the murder. Thomas, hobbled by his severe knee injury, was hidden inside a secret crawlspace beneath their apartment floorboards, emerging only in the dead of night when the streets were completely empty. Whenever detectives returned to ask follow-up questions, Arthur would answer the door, seamlessly adopting Thomas's mannerisms and speech patterns if required, completely scrambling the investigators' notes and creating a chaotic sequence of conflicting witness reports. The deception was so flawless, so utterly convincing, that the 1991 task force found themselves completely paralyzed, unable to establish probable cause against either brother because every piece of eyewitness evidence could be effortlessly countered by the existence of the other twin. But the psychological cost of their perfect crime was a slow, corrosive poison that destroyed their brotherhood from the inside out. Thomas explained that the guilt and the constant terror of exposure turned their shared apartment into a psychological prison. Every time they looked at each other, they were staring into the eyes of a killer and a co-conspirator. The explosive argument that the neighbor had overheard weeks after the murder was the final fracture. Arthur had demanded that Thomas leave Seattle forever, realizing that his brother's erratic behavior and deepening alcoholism would eventually expose them both. They made a pact of absolute silence, divided their assets, and vanished into opposite corners of the region, agreeing to never speak, never write, and never acknowledge each other's existence again, effectively burying their shared past beneath a mountain of lies. As Thomas's confession drew to a close, the detectives felt a profound sense of relief mingled with an overwhelming horror at the sheer scale of the deception. The mystery that had haunted the Seattle Police Department for 35 years was no longer a cold case. It was a map of human depravity and biological manipulation that had finally been decoded. But the legal battle was far from over. The prosecution now had to present this complex, multi-layered narrative to a modern jury, translating intricate epigenetic data, childhood photographs, and a decades-old twin conspiracy into a case that would ensure Thomas Pendleton spent the remainder of his natural life behind bars, while determining what legal consequences Arthur would face for his role as the ultimate architect of the cover-up. The city of Seattle braced itself for a trial that promised to be one of the most surreal and legally unprecedented spectacles in the history of American jurisprudence. The recording device in the room hummed quietly as Thomas sat back, the words finally out of him. The weight of the secret had bent his spine over 35 years, but now the truth belonged to the state. The lead detective gathered the files, his mind already racing ahead to the logistical nightmare of the upcoming trial. They had a confession, but they were dealing with defense attorneys who would challenge every syllable, every photo, and every strand of DNA. The town outside the window was dark now, the coastal Oregon rain striking the glass with a steady, rhythmic beat that sounded exactly like the rain in Seattle all those years ago. The Phantom had finally spoken, but the echoes of his words were about to tear the city apart. The news of Thomas Pendleton's full confession erupted across the national media landscape like a bombshell, transforming the 1991 Seattle cold case from a local tragedy into a global sensation. The headlines were relentless, dissecting every detail of the twin paradox murder, as journalists and legal scholars scrambled to understand how a killer had successfully hidden behind his brother's genetic code for over 3 decades. In Bellevue, the shockwaves tore through the quiet suburban neighborhood where Arthur Pendleton had lived his manufactured life of pristine respectability. Neighbors who had shared barbecues and book clubs with Arthur stood on their lawns in stunned disbelief, trying to reconcile the gentle, rose-gardening accountant with the cold, calculating criminal mastermind who had engineered a flawless cover-up for a brutal murder. The facade had been utterly shattered, leaving behind a wake of psychological devastation for Arthur's wife and children, who suddenly found themselves married to and raised by a man who was essentially a stranger, a ghost who had built a family on a foundation of blood and deception. As the legal machinery spun into motion, King County prosecutors faced an incredibly complex task, preparing 2 separate, highly specialized indictments. For Thomas Pendleton, the charge was murder in the first degree, a direct accusation backed by his own recorded confession, the photographic evidence of his knee injury, and the financial records linking him to the crime scene's immediate vicinity. For Arthur Pendleton, the legal situation was more nuanced but equally severe. He was charged with rendering criminal assistance in the first degree, conspiracy to obstruct justice, and multiple counts of identity fraud spanning 35 years. The defense attorneys for both brothers immediately went to work, attempting to minimize the damage, with Thomas's lawyers hinting that they would challenge the validity of the confession, claiming it was coerced under extreme psychological pressure and sleep deprivation during the cross-state interrogation. The stage was set for a monumental courtroom battle inside the King County Courthouse, a venue that would soon become the epicenter of a high-tech forensic drama. The trial of Thomas Pendleton began in the spring of 2026, drawing packed galleries of true crime enthusiasts, legal experts, and international reporters who queued up in the damp Seattle mornings just to secure a seat in the courtroom. The prosecution opened their case with a devastating, emotional presentation, projecting a massive, high-definition photograph of Evelyn Vance onto the courtroom screens, forcing the jury to confront the vibrant life that had been so cruelly extinguished in 1991. The lead prosecutor walked the jury through the gritty streets of Pioneer Square, recreating the atmosphere of the early 90s, before introducing the forensic centerpiece of the trial, the epigenetic data that had successfully shattered the twins' biological shield. The geneticists took the stand as expert witnesses, using advanced 3D animations to explain how Thomas's decades of isolation and lifestyle choices had left a distinct chemical signature on his DNA, a biological barcode that proved he was a completely separate legal entity from his brother Arthur, allowing the state to hold him individually accountable for his actions. The turning point of the trial came when the prosecution played the video recording of Thomas's confession. The courtroom was dead silent as Thomas's raspy voice filled the space, describing the violent struggle, the blow to his knee, and the cold-blooded conspiracy to switch identities with his brother to baffle the 1991 investigators. Evelyn Vance's sister, Sarah, sat in the front row of the gallery, tears streaming down her face as she finally heard the details of her sister's final moments, a closure that had been denied to her for more than half her life. The defense tried desperately to pivot, arguing that the confession lacked corroborating physical evidence from the scene itself due to the degradation of the 1991 samples, but the mounting wall of circumstantial evidence, the scar, the pawnshop receipts, the ATM ledger, created a narrative so tight, so logical, that the defense's arguments felt like desperate whispers against a roaring gales. After a grueling 3-week trial, the jury retired to deliberate, carrying with them boxes of forensic charts, photographic enlargements, and the heavy weight of a 35-year-old injustice. The city held its collective breath as the hours ticked away, wondering if the twin paradox would find one last loophole in the American legal system. But the jury's decision was swift and decisive. In less than 6 hours, they returned with a verdict that echoed through the halls of justice, guilty on all counts. Thomas Pendleton sat motionless as the word was read, his face an unreadable mask, while a collective gasp of relief washed over the gallery. The ghost of 1991 had finally been cornered, stripped of his biological disguise and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, ensuring that the man who had stolen Evelyn Vance's future would spend his own remaining days behind the gray walls of a maximum security penitentiary. The legal teams immediately prepared for the next phase, knowing that the conviction of Thomas was only half the battle. Arthur's trial would test the very limits of how the law defines complicity when bloodlines are perfectly blurred. Reporters gathered outside the courthouse steps, their microphones thrust toward the prosecutors who had just secured the historic win. The public demand for answers had not been satiated. It had merely shifted focus toward the brother who had stayed behind the scenes, pulling the strings of time and science. The rain began to fall harder, washing over the stone steps, as the city prepared itself to look back into the mirror one more time to see if the second twin would also fall. With Thomas Pendleton sentenced to spend the absolute remainder of his natural life behind the bleak concrete walls of a maximum security prison, the relentless spotlight of the American legal system shifted immediately to his identical mirror image, Arthur Pendleton. The public's morbid fascination with the case deepened exponentially, evolving from a standard high-profile murder trial into a profound, unsettling ethical and psychological examination of absolute complicity, brotherhood, and the dark limits of familial loyalty. Arthur's trial was not about the physical, blood-soaked act of murder itself, but about the cold-blooded calculation required to actively sustain a 35-year lie, a masterclass in systematic obstruction that had intentionally defeated the justice system and extended the agonizing torture of a grieving family for decades. The prosecution framed Arthur not as a passive, terrified bystander who simply kept a secret out of love, but as the primary intellectual architect of the entire deception, a man whose brilliant, analytical mind had weaponized his own unique twin biology to shield a monster from the reach of the law. The global legal community watched with intense, breathless interest, knowing that a conviction for rendering criminal assistance on this massive scale and over this unprecedented duration would set an extraordinary legal precedent for future cold cases involving genetically identical siblings. Arthur's elite defense team adopted a highly sophisticated, emotionally manipulative strategy, painting their client as a tragic victim of psychological coercion and intense, overwhelming family trauma. They argued fiercely that in the frantic, chaotic hours immediately following the brutal murder in November 1991, Arthur had been subjected to an intense emotional onslaught by his unstable, terrifying brother, entering a profound state of psychological shock that completely impaired his moral judgment and survival instincts. They claimed that Arthur's subsequent decades of perfect citizenship, his stable, loving marriage, and his quiet dedication to his suburban community were undeniable evidence of a deep, lifelong penance, a desperate, silent attempt to build a righteous life to balance out the pitch-black secret he carried in his soul. The defense tried desperately to convince the jury that sending an elderly, nonviolent man to a harsh prison for a crime physically committed by his brother 35 years ago would be a cruel act of societal vengeance rather than true justice, an unnecessary tragedy that would destroy another entirely innocent family, Arthur's blindsided wife and children. The trial reached a fever pitch of theatrical tension when Arthur Pendleton himself chose to take the witness stand, a rare, highly risky legal maneuver that kept the entire courtroom completely spellbound. Dressed in a sharp, conservative gray wool suit, looking every bit the respectable, gentle accountant he had pretended to be for decades, Arthur spoke with a soft, measured, and highly educated tone that contrasted sharply with his brother's raspy, desperate confession. He described to the gripped jury the suffocating, inescapable bond of being an identical twin, an intense, almost telepathic psychological connection where the boundaries of individual identity are constantly blurred from birth. "When Thomas came to me that freezing night covered in blood," Arthur said, turning his head to stare directly into the eyes of the jurors, his own eyes welling with calculated tears, "I didn't see a criminal. I saw myself. I saw half of my own body, half of my own soul, begging for survival. It was a moment of absolute madness, a choice made in a split second that I have spent every single day of the last 35 years deeply, silently regretting." The prosecution's cross-examination was an unmerciful, cold, and surgical deconstruction of Arthur's carefully crafted narrative of remorse. The lead prosecutor didn't focus on his soft voice or his tears. She focused entirely on his mathematical precision. She brought out the original 1991 police interview logs, showing the jury exactly how Arthur had calmly, methodically, and repeatedly lied to homicide detectives, carefully mimicking his brother's voice, effortlessly manipulating the investigators' perceptions to ensure that no charges could ever be filed against either of them. She highlighted the devastating fact that Arthur had lived a life of absolute luxury, stability, and peace, enjoying the fruits of a highly successful career and a loving family, while Evelyn Vance lay rotting in a cold grave and her family disintegrated under the weight of an unsolved nightmare. "You didn't protect your brother out of love, Mr. Pendleton," the prosecutor declared, her voice ringing through the silent, packed courtroom like a hammer blow. "You protected him because you absolutely loved the power of beating the system. You loved the thrill of being smarter than the law, smarter than the science, and smarter than justice itself." The jury was left to weigh the profound, terrifying moral complexity of Arthur's actions. They had to decide if a life of subsequent good deeds could ever erase the sin of a foundational, catastrophic lie that had actively derailed a murder investigation for more than a generation. The deliberations were intense, prolonged, and highly emotional, lasting for 3 full days as the jurors passionately debated the legal definitions of complicity, the nature of criminal assistance, and the boundaries of shared guilt. When the verdict was finally delivered on a dark Friday afternoon, it was a total, crushing victory for the state. Arthur Pendleton was found guilty on all counts of rendering criminal assistance and conspiracy to obstruct justice. The judge, showing absolutely no leniency for what he described as a calculated, decades-long assault on the very integrity of the judicial system, sentenced Arthur to 15 years in state prison, ensuring that the twins who had used their identicality to escape justice would ultimately share the exact same fate, a cold, lonely, and isolated existence inside a concrete cell. As Arthur was led away in handcuffs, his pristine suit jacket wrinkling against the chains, he did not look back at his weeping family. The transformation was complete. The respectable Bellevue accountant had vanished, leaving only the convicted conspirator, stripped of his white-collar disguise. The courtroom slowly emptied, but the heavy atmosphere of the trial remained, a chilling reminder of how deeply a lie can bury itself into the structure of a life. The detectives who had worked the case since its icy revival stood in the corridor, exhausted but quietly satisfied, knowing that the legal battle for Evelyn Vance was officially over. Yet, as the rain continued to beat against the high glass windows of the King County Courthouse, an unsettling feeling lingered in the air, a quiet suspicion that the dark story of the Pendleton twins still held secrets that had not yet been dragged into the light of the courtroom. The conviction of both Pendleton twins brought a definitive, legally binding end to the formal courtroom proceedings, but it did absolutely nothing to quiet the profound, deeply unsettling echo that the historic case left in its wake. The Pacific Northwest had seen its share of notorious serial killers, phantom stalkers, and bizarre criminal conspiracies over the decades, but the Twin Paradox murder of 1991 occupied a unique, terrifyingly cerebral space in the collective psyche of Seattle. The case instantly became a mandatory staple of study in law enforcement academies, forensic science universities, and psychological research institutes across the globe, a textbook example of how modern, cutting-edge technology could be deployed to pierce through the most bizarre and unprecedented alibi matrices ever conceived. The King County Homicide Unit, which had carried the dead weight of the Evelyn Vance file like an open, festering wound for 35 long years, finally experienced a quiet, heavy sense of professional closure. Their active archive room was short one cold case file, but the hard-fought victory felt hollow, a grim and sobering reminder of how easily justice can be delayed, manipulated, and mocked by a freak occurrence of nature combined with a ruthless conspiracy of silence. For the devastated Vance family, the final resolution of the case was a bittersweet, emotionally exhausting milestone that marked the end of a lifelong, painful vigil. Sarah Vance, who had spent her entire adult life carrying the heavy torch of remembrance for her murdered sister, found herself standing before a vast, dense sea of flashing cameras and thrust microphones on the stone steps of the courthouse following Arthur's final sentencing. The afternoon rain was falling softly, mimicking with terrifying accuracy the exact, miserable weather of that fatal November night in 1991. For 35 years, my family was told that my sister's killer was a ghost, a phantom that simply did not exist in the physical world, Sarah said, her voice trembling with decades of unshed tears, but remaining entirely resolute. Today, we finally know the terrifying truth. The monster wasn't a ghost. It was two men who willingly traded their humanity for a coordinated lie. Science gave us my sister's name back, and it took away their masks. There is no triumph today, only a long overdue, freezing peace. Following that final press conference, Sarah faded completely from the public eye, returning to her quiet life away from the cameras, leaving behind the massive media circus that had briefly transformed her family's private, agonizing hell into a national entertainment spectacle. Meanwhile, behind the scenes, relentless investigative journalists and obsessed true crime researchers began digging aggressively into the deeper, completely untold history of the Pendleton twins, looking for other unresolved anomalies, missing persons reports, or cold cases that had occurred in the various regions where the brothers had lived during their decades of alleged separation. A chilling, deeply paranoid theory began to circulate heavily among homicide task forces and online sleuth communities. If Thomas and Arthur had successfully deployed their identity-swapping alibi matrix to effortlessly escape a brutal murder charge in 1991, was it truly possible that Evelyn Vance was their only victim? Police departments across Oregon and Washington began quietly auditing their own dusty cold case archives from the late 90s and early 2000s, looking for unsolved homicides or mysterious, sudden disappearances that featured similar signatures of surgical precision, a complete lack of physical evidence, or peculiar witness reports describing a prime suspect who seemed to possess a double, an inconsistent personality, or an impossible alibi. The growing fear that the twins had operated a prolonged, highly covert career of coordinated criminal violence cast a long, terrifying shadow over their entire adult timeline, turning their closed case into a potential gateway to an even larger, more monstrous web of hidden secrets. Inside the monolithic walls of the Washington State Penitentiary, the twins who had spent 35 years refusing to acknowledge each other's physical existence were intentionally housed in entirely separate wings, completely cut off from any form of contact, unable to ever see, speak to, or hear from one another again. Correctional officers assigned to their blocks noted that both elderly men exhibited a strange, eerily parallel behavior pattern. They would spend hours sitting perfectly still, staring out their narrow, barred cell windows at the gray, rain-swept sky of the Pacific Northwest, as if still listening for the distant, chaotic echoes of the city where their lives had been simultaneously forged and destroyed. The identical faces that had once been their ultimate source of power, an absolute biological shield against the machinery of the law, had now become their ultimate, permanent curse, a cruel, unavoidable mirror image of their shared guilt and the innocent sisterly blood that had bound them together in an eternal, inescapable pact of damnation. The illusion of their perfect crime had been completely shattered, leaving behind nothing but the cold, clinical reality of a prison cell and the crushing, suffocating weight of a memory that would never fade. As the months rolled into years, the vibrant city of Seattle continued its relentless evolution, its high-tech glass towers reaching higher into the damp clouds, its rapid, tech-driven economy completely washing away the last gritty, brick-and-mortar remnants of the early 90s underground grunge scene. The old, weathered apartment building in Pioneer Square where Evelyn Vance had lived, painted, and ultimately died was eventually demolished by developers, replaced by a sleek, ultra-modern commercial complex that showed absolutely no physical trace of the horrific violence that had once occurred on its grounds. But for those who intimately knew the history, for the retired detectives who had walked those bloody floors, the prosecutors who had fought the legal paradox, and the geneticists who had decoded the twins' cellular secrets, that specific patch of land remained a haunting monument to a profound mystery. The historic case had proved to the world that while human deception can be incredibly elaborate, calculated, and sustained across entire generations, the truth possesses a relentless, microscopic patience, waiting silently in the absolute darkness of a cold case file until science finally gives it the voice to speak and tear down the most sophisticated labyrinth of lies. The files were transferred to the deep archives, sealed in steel cabinets away from the daily operations of the precinct. Yet, the detectives who had lived through the investigation found themselves unable to entirely let it go. In the quiet hours of the night shift, when the rain hit the precinct windows with that familiar, rhythmic drumming, they would find themselves opening the digital copies of the Pendleton Ledger. They would study the gap years, the massive, unrecorded spaces between 1991 and 2026, where the brothers claimed to have lived completely separate, independent lives. The math didn't completely add up. The absolute perfection of their initial cover-up suggested a level of coordination that didn't just vanish after a single argument. The suspicion was a silent infection in the department, a growing realization that the courtroom victory was merely the prologue to a much larger, darker chronicle that was still waiting to be uncovered in the damp earth of the coast. The legacy of the Pendleton case continued to ripple violently through the international scientific and legal communities long after the heavy iron prison doors had officially closed on the identical brothers. In advanced forensic laboratories from Tokyo to London, the historic Seattle twin breakthrough quickly became the primary catalyst for a massive, comprehensive reevaluation of how genetic evidence was handled in cases involving multiple siblings, close relatives, or complex family trees. The stunning success of the epigenetic sequencing matrix in successfully differentiating Arthur and Thomas Pendleton proved to the medical world that the human body is a living ledger, a biological diary that permanently records every single choice, every trauma, every diet change, and every environmental poison an individual encounters throughout their life journey. Scientists began developing even more sensitive techniques, aiming to map the cellular changes that occur within days or weeks of a violent crime, hoping to create a forensic tool that could instantly pinpoint which individual within a genetically identical pair was experiencing high stress or adrenaline at the exact moment an offense was committed, effectively neutralizing the twin alibi defense before it could ever be weaponized in a courtroom again. In the true crime underground and the digital corridors of internet forums, the intense fascination with the Pendleton twins refused to die down. Groundbreaking documentaries were produced, investigative books were published, and amateur sleuths continued to pore over every public record associated with the brothers' lives. The focus shifted heavily toward the theory of the hidden victims, with online communities building massive, collaborative databases that cross-reference Thomas's transient logging routes through Oregon with unsolved disappearances of young women in the mid to late 1990s. Every unsolved case within a 50-mile radius of Thomas's known locations was subjected to an intense public scrutiny, with internet users searching for any mention of a limping suspect, a silver watch, or a gold ring. The public had essentially become a decentralized cold case task force, driven by a collective obsession to find out if the silence the twins maintained was hiding a much larger, more terrifying body count than the state had ever proven in court. This intense public pressure and the discovery of structural gaps in the original case timelines eventually forced law enforcement agencies to take definitive action. In 2028, a multi-agency task force comprising veteran detectives from the Oregon State Police, the King County Sheriff's Office, and the FBI was quietly formed to officially investigate the twins' timeline post, 1991. They codenamed the highly sensitive operation Project Mirror. The task force utilized advanced data mining algorithms to track every single credit card transaction, every vehicle registration, and every casual labor cash payment associated with both Arthur and Thomas over a 30-year period. They were looking for anomalies, moments where Arthur's financial footprint suddenly appeared in a remote part of Oregon where Thomas was supposedly living, or moments where Thomas's signature showed up on documents in Seattle while Arthur was allegedly away on corporate business. The investigators were operating under a chilling hypothesis that the twins had never truly stopped swapping places, that their estrangement was another layer of the elaborate smokescreen, and that they had continued to trade identities throughout their adult lives to facilitate a series of undetected crimes across the entire Pacific Northwest. The deeper the task force dug into the digital archives, the more unsettling the timeline became. They discovered a series of unexplained cash deposits into Thomas's Oregon bank accounts that originated from a branch in Bellevue, the exact branch where Arthur held his primary personal account. The deposits occurred twice a year, every year, for over 2 decades, always in the dead of winter, and always for the exact same amount, $5,000. This directly contradicted Thomas's statement during his confession that he and his brother had completely severed all ties following their final argument in late 1991. The financial thread proved that a secret, financial pipeline had existed between the suburban accountant and the isolated carpenter for 25 years. It wasn't an estrangement. It was a partnership, a long-distance system of maintenance, or MORWY, a series of hush-money payments designed to keep Thomas quiet and secure in his remote cabin, ensuring that the fragile peace Arthur had built in Bellevue was never threatened by a desperate, alcohol-fueled confession from his identical counterpart. The discovery of the secret financial pipeline breathed a terrifying new life into the investigation. The task force realized that the story they had presented to the jury in 2026 was only a fragment of a much larger, more coordinated conspiracy. They began to focus on a specific, unresolved disappearance from the summer of 1997, a 19-year-old college student named Melissa Vance, who had vanished without a trace from a campsite near Mount Hood, Oregon. The surname was an extraordinary, heart-stopping coincidence that sent a chill through the entire task force. Melissa was a distant cousin of Evelyn Vance, the original 1991 victim. The records showed that at the time of Melissa's disappearance, Thomas Pendleton was working at a sawmill just 10 miles from the campground, and the financial logs revealed that Arthur had made an unscheduled, hurried withdrawal of $10,000 from his Bellevue account just 24 hours before Melissa vanished into the wilderness. The shadow of the twin paradox was stretching once again, threatening to engulf another family in a fresh wave of horror and psychological vertigo. The team expanded their operations, setting up a secure field office closer to the Oregon border. The investigation had outgrown the dusty archives of Seattle, shifting toward the rugged, heavily forested geography where Thomas had spent his exile. Detectives began re-interviewing old loggers, retired park rangers, and former residents of the logging towns, looking for any memory of the twins together in the late 90s. They encountered a wall of fading memories and general indifference, but a few individuals recalled a strange detail, a man who looked exactly like the quiet carpenter Thomas, but who spoke with the sharp, articulate authority of a city professional, appearing at local diners during the exact weeks the cash deposits were made. The puzzle was no longer about a single night of violence in 1991. It had transformed into a lifelong, coordinated game of biological hide-and-seek, where the stakes were human lives and the playing field was the entire geographic expanse of the Pacific Northwest. The revelation of the undeniable connection to Melissa Vance's 1997 disappearance sent a massive jolt of pure adrenaline through the Project Mirror task force, instantly shifting the investigation from a retrospective, academic analysis into an active, high-priority hunt for a second body. The coincidence of the surname was simply too monstrous, too statistically impossible to ignore. It suggested that the Pendleton twins' obsession wasn't a localized, random outburst of violence, but a targeted, multi-generational predation against a specific family line, or perhaps a twisted form of retributive violence that had remained completely hidden from the world for decades. Investigators rushed back to the high-security blocks of the Washington State Penitentiary, attempting to interview both brothers separately about the events of the summer of 1997 and the secret financial pipeline that linked their bank accounts. But the twins had reverted completely to their original state of absolute, impenetrable silence. Thomas refused to even leave his cell for questioning, staring blankly at the cold concrete wall, while Arthur's high-priced legal team immediately filed an emergency federal injunction to halt any further interrogations, claiming the state was engaged in an unconstitutional fishing expedition that violated their clients' rights against harassment and double jeopardy. The total wall of silence from the prison cells meant that the task force had to find their answers elsewhere, specifically in the damp, dark, and unforgiving earth of the Mount Hood wilderness. A massive, unprecedented forensic search operation was launched in the early summer, deploying ground-penetrating radar, elite cadaver dog teams, and specialized search and rescue units to comb through hundreds of acres of dense, overgrown forest surrounding the long-abandoned sawmill where Thomas had worked during that fateful summer of 1997. The search was a grueling, logistically nightmarish endeavor. 30 years of shifting terrain, decomposing organic matter, landslides, and heavy winter snowfalls had buried any potential evidence beneath thick layers of heavy mud and twisted roots. For weeks, the teams found absolutely nothing but old, rusted logging equipment, forgotten trash, and animal bones, the atmosphere growing increasingly tense as the local media caught wind of the massive operation, broadcasting live daily updates from the edge of the search zone, bringing the specter of the twin paradox back into the living rooms of the Pacific Northwest. Then, on the 24th day of the intensive search, deep within a secluded, shadow-choked ravine that was completely invisible from the main logging trails, a highly decorated cadaver dog named Buster alerted heavily near the base of an ancient, hollowed-out cedar tree. The forensic team moved in with meticulous care, using precision hand tools and delicate brushes to slowly peel back the thick layers of damp moss and rotted pine needles. 6 inches beneath the surface, their shovels struck something solid, a weathered, heavily rusted metal toolbox that had been padlocked shut and wrapped in multiple layers of heavy, industrial-grade plastic sheeting. The entire area was instantly cordoned off as a high-security crime scene, the flashing blue and red lights of forensic vans illuminating the deep forest canopy as night began to fall over the mountain. When the laboratory technicians carefully cut through the padlock inside a secure mobile laboratory, they didn't find human remains. They found an archive of pure, unadulterated horror. Inside the toolbox were several items of vintage women's clothing, a collection of old, faded driver's licenses, and a single, pristine silver watch with a cracked glass face, the exact watch worn by the twin in the childhood photograph, the twin who had been identified as Thomas Pendleton. Among the personal items was a series of handwritten notebooks, their pages damp and severely yellowed with age, but the ink still stable enough to reveal a chilling, comprehensive narrative record of the brothers' movements and inner thoughts throughout the entire decade of the 90s. The state handwriting analysis quickly confirmed that the entries were written by both Arthur and Thomas, their distinct script styles alternating from section to section, sometimes even within the very same entry. The notebooks completely demolished the narrative of their estrangement, revealing that they had met in secret at that exact remote ravine multiple times a year, using the hidden toolbox as a highly secure dead-drop system to exchange large sums of cash, letters, and tactical instructions. The entries described a terrifying, shared psychological state, an ongoing, dark dialogue where they debated the nature of their identity, their shared guilt over Evelyn Vance, and their mutual fascination with the absolute power they held over the law. But the most explosive, devastating revelation was buried in a brief entry dated July 12, 1997, the exact day Melissa Vance disappeared from her campsite. The entry, written in Arthur's precise, neat accounting script, contained a single, terrifying line that sent a wave of absolute shock through the entire task force. The shadow has returned to the woods, and the double has walked the trail. The circle is complete, and the code remains unbroken. Beneath this cryptic, chilling text was a highly detailed, hand-drawn map of an isolated, treacherous section of the White River Glacier, located significantly further up the slopes of Mount Hood. The investigators realized with an overwhelming horror that they were looking at a burial map, a direct, explicit guide to the final resting place of Melissa Vance, written by the very brother who had claimed under oath that he was a gentle, innocent suburban family man living 300 miles away in Bellevue. The illusion of Arthur's total innocence was gone forever. He wasn't just a reluctant accomplice who had covered up a single mistake out of familial love. He was an active, willing partner in a multi-decade matrix of psychological terror and violence, a man who had used his brother as a physical weapon while keeping his own hands meticulously clean in the eyes of the world. The task force instantly packed their equipment. The secure forest camp dismantled within hours as the focus of the entire operation shifted up the mountain toward the ice. The notebooks were flown under armed guard back to the forensic unit in Seattle, where technicians worked around the clock to scan every single page before the fragile paper could degrade any further. The realization that the twins had maintained a functional, criminal partnership for decades changed the entire nature of the case. It was no longer an investigation into a single historical murder, but the unraveling of a lifetime of coordinated deception. As the first light of dawn hit the snow-covered peaks of Mount Hood, a fleet of high-altitude transport helicopters carrying the recovery teams began their ascent toward the glacier, guided by the hand-drawn map of a killer who had thought his secrets were permanently frozen in time. The discovery of the handwritten notebooks and the hidden glacier map violently transformed the Pendleton saga from a resolved cold case into a terrifyingly expansive chronicle of systemic violence, dark biology, and psychological horror. The Project Mirror task force immediately redirected their entire operational strength toward the high-altitude, treacherous terrain of the White River Glacier, coordinating with elite mountaineering teams, glacier rescue units, and specialized geological forensics experts to execute an unprecedented recovery operation in the freezing, shifting ice fields of Mount Hood. The logistical challenges were immense, bordering on the impossible. Glaciers are dynamic, dangerous architectural structures of nature that constantly move, fracture, expand, and swallow anything caught within their icy grasp over decades. Guided by the precise coordinates decoded from Arthur Pendleton's hand-drawn map, the high-altitude recovery team deployed advanced deep ice radar systems, methodically scanning the frozen depths for any physical anomaly that matched the density signature of human remains or personal belongings entombed since the summer of 1997. The city of Seattle and the wider nation watched the unfolding mountain operation with a breathless, horrified fascination that eclipsed the original trial. The realization that Arthur Pendleton, the soft-spoken, rose-gardening white-collar accountant, had actively participated in a second, highly calculated crime against the exact same family line completely shattered any remaining public sympathy or legal doubt regarding his character. The public narrative shifted permanently. The twins were no longer viewed as tragic figures trapped in a biological anomaly, but as a coordinated, predatory dual entity that had turned their identicality into a lethal weapon designed to manipulate, terrify, and destroy. The Vance family was plunged into a surreal, overlapping state of fresh grief and historic resolution as Sarah Vance found herself once again waiting for news from the mountains, praying that the ice would finally give up the secrets that had haunted her family for a generation. On the fifth day of the grueling high-altitude operation, a mile up the steep glacier face, the deep ice radar detected a distinct, symmetrical shadow frozen 30 feet beneath a massive wall of blue glacial ice. The recovery team worked for 48 hours straight under sub-zero temperatures, freezing winds, and blinding whiteout glare, using specialized steam drills and thermal saws to melt a precise vertical shaft down toward the anomaly. When the ice finally cleared, the technicians found themselves staring through a transparent, frozen wall at a perfectly preserved scene from 1997. It was Melissa Vance, her youthful features frozen in time by the absolute zero of the glacier, her winter clothing completely intact, her eyes closed as if sleeping inside a crystal chamber. Beside her rested a gold ring, the exact, heavy gold ring visible on the hand of the second twin in the 1991 childhood photograph, the ring that belonged definitively to Arthur Pendleton. The physical bridge between the suburban accountant and the remote murder scene had finally been found, frozen in the ice, waiting for 31 years to destroy his alibi forever. The physical recovery of Melissa's body and the discovery of the gold ring provided the King County and Oregon prosecutors with an absolute, undeniable matrix of physical evidence. Arthur Pendleton was immediately served with a new, massive indictment inside his prison cell for murder in the first degree, kidnapping, and conspiracy. The defense strategy that had previously painted him as a traumatized, reluctant accomplice collapsed into absolute irrelevance. He was now facing the prospect of a mandatory life sentence with no possibility of parole, ensuring that his 15-year obstruction sentence would be converted into a permanent termination of his freedom. The legal system had finally caught up with both brothers, completely dismantling the twin paradox that had once seemed so impenetrable, proving that no matter how elaborate the deception, no matter how perfectly identical the disguise, the physical reality of a crime leaves a signature that can never be entirely erased by time or nature. The final chapter of the Pendleton saga left a permanent, haunting imprint on the memory of the Pacific Northwest. The twins who had tried to live as a single character in a dark, violent play were left to grow old and die in separate, concrete cells, their names forever synonymous with the absolute limits of human deception and familial corruption. The case stands as a stark, chilling reminder that the shadows of the past are never truly dead. They are merely waiting beneath the rain, beneath the ice, or deep within the microscopic code of our own cells, waiting for the light of truth to finally pierce the darkness and bring a long-overdue justice to those who thought they had executed the perfect crime. The rain continues to fall over Seattle, washing over the concrete, but the secrets that once lay buried beneath its heavy, gray mist have finally been dragged into the light, leaving a quiet, permanent peace in the wake of a decades-long nightmare. The ultimate finality of the second forensic discovery reverberated through the very architecture of the Pacific Northwest's legal history, acting as the absolute closing movement in a multi-generational symphony of distortion. With the retrieval of Melissa Vance from her icy vault and the ironclad physical linkage of Arthur's gold ring to the high-altitude grave, the structural illusion of the twins' independent survival collapsed entirely. The Department of Corrections, acting on an unprecedented emergency directive from the federal judiciary, instituted an absolute communications blackout on both men, permanently terminating their access to general populations, mail services, and legal visitations that were not subject to extreme federal scrutiny. The twins, who had spent a lifetime treating the physical universe as a stage for their synchronized deception, were now fully partitioned, transformed into isolated biological units housed in high-security isolation units, separated by hundreds of miles of concrete, steel, and static monitoring equipment. The strategic silence they had weaponized so effectively in the early 90s was turned back upon them, becoming an absolute, permanent sensory vacuum from which neither brother would ever escape. In the legal war rooms of King County, prosecutors spent the summer of 2028 finalizing what would be known in the legal ledgers as the ultimate consolidated indictment. There was no longer any need to dance around the genetic twin paradox that had crippled the 1991 task force. The science of the present day, combined with the raw physical recovery of their hidden vault, had rewritten the rules of engagement. The new trial was designed not merely to convict Arthur of the 1997 murder, but to legally declare the brothers a unified, continuous criminal enterprise from the exact moment of Evelyn Vance's death. The legal strategy, orchestrated by a coalition of state prosecutors and federal attorneys, treated the twins not as separate individuals who aided one another, but as a singular, multi-headed predatory entity that had actively defrauded the state, exploited biological science, and committed serial violence across 2 decades. The indictment was a massive, 3,000-page document that detailed every single cash transaction, every identity swap, every falsified medical record, and every secret meeting in the shadow-choked ravine of Mount Hood, constructing an unassailable fortress of evidence that no defense team on Earth could ever hope to dismantle. The public reaction to the final revelations was marked by a deep, collective sobriety. The initial true crime sensationalism, the internet sleuth forums, and the media circus that had characterized the 2026 trial dissolved into a profound sense of horror at the sheer scale of the deception. The suburban illusion of Bellevue, with its manicured lawns, corporate accounting firms, and pristine rose gardens, was permanently stained by the realization that a monster of such calculated precision could coexist with middle-class respectability for 35 years without ever slipping his mask. The local community organizations where Arthur had volunteered, the libraries he had supported, and the neighborhood associations he had led underwent a painful, public purge, stripping his name from every ledger and record as if attempting to violently erase his very existence from their collective memory. The city had realized that the most dangerous aspect of the Pendleton twins wasn't their capacity for physical violence, but their absolute, terrifying ability to simulate human decency so flawlessly that the simulation became indistinguishable from the truth. For Sarah Vance, the long journey through the darkness of her family's history reached its quiet, absolute horizon. Standing on the banks of the White River, far beneath the towering, snow-covered peak of Mount Hood where her cousin had been held by the ice for over 30 years, she oversaw a private, silent memorial service away from the cameras and the microphones. The remains of Evelyn and Melissa were finally laid to rest side by side in a small, historic cemetery overlooking the valley, their graves marked by simple stone monuments that bore only their names, their dates of birth, and the word redeemed. The long, agonizing vigil that had defined Sarah's entire adult life was finally over. The phantoms had been stripped of their power, the legal machinery had executed its final judgments, and the earth had surrendered its secrets. As the sun set behind the jagged volcanic peaks, casting long, golden shadows across the quiet graves, the heavy air of the Pacific Northwest seemed to clear, leaving behind a profound, monumental stillness that had been denied to the valley for nearly 4 decades. Inside the deep, concrete subterranean corridors of the state penitentiary, the old man who had once been known to the world as Arthur Pendleton sat under the harsh, unyielding glare of a permanent security light. His hands, no longer manicured or steady, lay flat on the cold steel surface of his cell table, his gaze fixed on the small, barred window that looked out onto the gray, eternal downpour of the Washington coast. There were no more numbers to calculate, no more ledgers to balance, and no twin brother waiting in the mist to catch the falling pieces of his fractured identity. The mirror had been violently shattered, and the reflection it cast back was no longer identical, no longer perfect, and no longer free. The science had spoken, the ice had broken, and the law had executed its final, absolute rewrite, leaving the twins to wither away in the darkness of their separate cells, a permanent, chilling monument to the absolute reality that no matter how deep the lie is buried, the truth will wait in the freezing dark until the world is finally ready to listen. Part 13. The closure of the legal proceedings did not mark the end of the Pendleton phenomenon. Instead, it initiated a dark, academic autopsy of the brothers' minds that would consume the fields of criminal psychology and behavioral genetics for the next generation. The Consolidated Twin Ledger, as the complete investigative file was officially designated, was transferred into a secure digital archive managed jointly by the Federal Bureau of Investigation and the University of Washington's Forensic Psychiatry Department. For the first time in modern legal history, criminologists were not dealing with a lone serial offender or a traditional criminal partnership, but with a synchronized psychological anomaly, a phenomenon researchers quickly termed shared identity criminality. Specialists from around the world began analyzing the thousands of pages of handwritten notebooks recovered from the Mount Hood ravine, seeking to map the exact point where the twins' individual consciousness had dissolved into a single, collective drive for deception and violence. The data revealed a chilling reality. Arthur and Thomas had not merely assisted each other, they had psychologically merged, creating a third, invisible persona that existed only through their coordinated actions. In the secure medical wing of the state penitentiary, a team of court-appointed psychiatrists attempted to conduct a series of comprehensive, independent evaluations of Arthur Pendleton, who is now serving consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole. The interviews, recorded under strict federal guidelines, quickly became legendary within the psychiatric community for their surreal, deeply unsettling nature. Arthur sat behind a thick sheet of reinforced plexiglass, his posture still maintaining a ghostly remnant of his former corporate dignity, but his speech patterns had undergone a profound, regressive transformation. When questioned about his childhood, his marriage, or the corporate career he had built in Bellevue, Arthur referred to himself exclusively in the plural, using the pronoun we with a chilling, natural consistency that baffled his interviewers. "We built that house in Bellevue," he would state softly, his eyes fixed on the psychiatrist's pen. "We passed the CPA exam. We planted the roses." The doctors realized that the decades of identity fraud had permanently fractured Arthur's ego. He was no longer capable of perceiving himself as an isolated human being, his mind entirely dependent on the existence of the mirror image that was now locked away in a separate prison wing hundreds of miles away. Meanwhile, in the distant coastal facility where Thomas Pendleton was housed, a completely different manifestation of the same psychological decay was taking place. Cut off from the financial support of his brother and the isolating safety of his Oregon cabin, Thomas's mental stability rapidly deteriorated under the pressure of total confinement. He became intensely paranoid, claiming that the guards were constantly trying to replace him with his brother, or that Arthur had somehow managed to switch places with a regular inmate to observe him from the shadows of the recreation yard. The prison medical staff noted that Thomas spent his nights pacing the exact dimensions of his cell with a rhythmic, heavy limp, his fingers constantly tracing the jagged childhood scar on his left knee, as if using the physical trauma to anchor his slipping sense of reality. The physical mark that had ultimately broken their flawless alibi machine in the courtroom had become his last remaining proof of individuality, a silver line of scar tissue that separated him from the ghost of the brother who shared his face. The profound cultural impact of the Pendleton case left an indelible, sobering mark on the entire Pacific Northwest. The myth of the perfect suburban life, the white picket fence, and the professional success of the tech boom was permanently haunted by the memory of the Bellevue accountant who had carried a glacier burial map in his leather briefcase. The local real estate market in the neighborhood where Arthur had lived experienced a significant, prolonged downturn, as families refused to purchase homes within sight of the manicured property where the ultimate architect of the cover-up had raised his children. The city of Seattle, which had spent decades trying to clean up the gritty, crime-ridden image of its early 90s underground scene, found itself permanently tethered to the tragedy of Evelyn Vance, her art exhibitions and final moments preserved in the historical memory of the city as a permanent warning about the dark shadows that can look exactly like the people we trust. As the decade drew toward its close, the Project Mirror task force was officially deactivated, its mission accomplished, its files sealed, and its personnel reassigned to other cold case units across the country. The detectives who had spearheaded the historic investigation gathered one final time in a quiet diner overlooking the gray, rain-swept expanse of Puget Sound, raising a silent toast to the memory of Evelyn and Melissa Vance. The victory they had achieved was total, absolute, and scientifically historic, yet as they watched the relentless rain wash over the concrete streets of the city, they knew that the true mystery of the Pendleton twins would never completely dissolve. The science of forensics had successfully broken the biological shield, the legal system had executed its absolute judgments, and the earth had finally given up its dead, but the dark, telepathic boundary of the identical twins remained an impenetrable fortress, a freezing monument to a lifetime of synchronized deception that had finally, permanently run out of time. The final psychological dissolution of the Pendleton anomaly occurred not with explosive legal revelation, but with the quiet, synchronized cessation of their biological machinery. In the late winter of 2031, exactly 40 years after the blood of Evelyn Vance was first absorbed by the hardwood floors of Pioneer Square, the computational systems monitoring the medical telemetry of the Washington State Department of Corrections registered a near-simultaneous spike in cardiac distress across two entirely separate institutional facilities. Thomas Pendleton, whose physical form had been thoroughly hollowed out by decades of severe alcoholic exposure and the unforgiving confinement of his maximum security cell, suffered a catastrophic myocardial infarction at exactly 3:14 a.m. Less than 4 minutes later, across the state in the specialized psychiatric infirmary, the alarm arrays connected to Arthur Pendleton's life support cradle began a continuous, flatline drone. The prison medical examiners who performed the dual autopsies noted with a sense of profound, clinical unease that the structural damage within the twin hearts was identical, a mirrored, genetic failure that executed its final sentence at the exact same biological moment, as if the invisible thread that had bound their actions across a lifetime of violence had finally pulled them both into the void together. The double death of the brothers triggered the immediate, automated release of the final, classified addenda of the Project Mirror ledger to the Federal Forensic Archives. Among the thousands of digitized pages made available to the behavioral analysis teams was a single, highly anomalous file that had been recovered from a secure, encrypted partition inside Arthur's corporate office computer in Bellevue, a document titled simply The Symmetrical Alibi. The file was not a confession, nor was it a traditional diary. It was a complex, mathematical manual of identity deception, written by Arthur during the mid-90s to codify the exact rules of engagement the brothers had used to defeat the 1991 homicide task force. The document detailed the exact vocal frequencies required to mimic one another over analog phone lines, the precise geometric angles needed to simulate a shared posture, and the tactical rotation schedules they used to ensure that neither brother ever remained in the same city long enough to develop a distinct, individualized digital or physical footprint. It was a terrifyingly cold, architectural blueprint for the absolute erasure of individual identity in the service of an ongoing criminal conspiracy. The publication of The Symmetrical Alibi sent a final, freezing shockwave through the legal landscape, forcing a complete overhaul of how federal authorities processed high-security identification protocols for identical multiples. The dynamic biometric systems that had once relied heavily on facial architecture, standard DNA sequencing, and basic fingerprint matrices were systematically replaced across all federal infrastructure with advanced, real-time epigenetic monitoring arrays and vascular path analysis, tools specifically engineered to ensure that no human being could ever again hide behind the biological reflection of a twin. The Pendleton case had effectively forced the machinery of the state to evolve, dragging the field of forensic identification out of the analog remnants of the 20th century and into a highly clinical, microscopic era where the human body is treated as a shifting, constantly recording ledger of individual experience that cannot be forged, shared, or hidden behind a mask of blood. For the city of Seattle, the departure of the twins from the physical world allowed the long-faded scars of the 1991 nightmare to finally scar over into permanent history. The local galleries in the historic district of Pioneer Square established a permanent, collaborative scholarship fund in the name of Evelyn and Melissa Vance, dedicated to supporting young, independent artists who arrived in the Pacific Northwest to capture the unique, rain-swept light of the valley. The artwork that Evelyn had left behind, the chaotic, vibrant canvases that had been recovered from her blood-stained apartment and preserved for decades inside police evidence vaults, was finally released to the public, taking its rightful place on the clean, white walls of the Seattle Art Museum. The exhibition was titled simply Beyond the Mist, drawing thousands of silent, respectful visitors who came not to gawk at the sensational details of a historic cold case, but to finally honor the creative spirit that had been so violently, systematically silenced by the phantoms of the twin paradox. As the decades continued to roll over the rugged, green expanse of the Pacific Northwest, the concrete streets of Pioneer Square remain wet with the eternal, drumming rain that defines the geography of the coast. The high-tech glass towers of the modern metropolis continue to shine through the heavy fog, their lights reflecting off the dark waters of Puget Sound, completely oblivious to the ancient, analog secrets that once lay buried beneath the damp earth of the city. The files of the Pendleton Ledger remain secure in the deep digital archives, a monument to a profound and terrifying chapter of American jurisprudence that proved how easily the truth can be contorted by human malice and biological coincidence. The rain continues to fall, washing away the grease, the oil, and the footprints of the passing crowd. But the physical reality of the justice that was finally executed in the frozen heights of Mount Hood remains an unyielding, monumental landmark, a permanent guarantee that no matter how perfect the mirror, no matter how deep the lie, the microscopic memory of a crime will always wait in the darkness until the light of truth finally sets the record straight. The physical erasure of Arthur and Thomas Pendleton from the living world did not entirely sterilize the atmosphere of suspicion that had gripped the King County Homicide Department for nearly 4 decades. In the months following the simultaneous flatlines in the winter of 2031, a quiet, specialized archival team was tasked with the final decommission of the physical evidence lockers associated with Project Mirror. It was a standard bureaucratic protocol, a routine clearing of space meant to convert decades of material tragedy into digitized reference codes. Yet, as the technicians began the meticulous process of cataloging the actual metal toolbox recovered from the deep, shadow-choked ravine of Mount Hood, they encountered a structural anomaly that had bypassed the initial field examinations. The bottom of the rusted steel container was double-walled, separated by a microscopic hydraulic seal that had only released its lock due to the progressive degradation of the metal housing over time. Inside this ultimate, hidden compartment lay a final, single microcassette tape, wrapped in vulcanized rubber and dated November 16, 1991, exactly 48 hours after the brutal slaughter of Evelyn Vance. The discovery of the tape triggered a silent, high-level gathering within the Seattle Forensic Archives, bringing together the aging detectives who had broken the genetic twin paradox just 5 years prior. The audio restoration process was painstaking, requiring the extraction of magnetic data from a tape that had been subjected to the freezing temperatures and damp elements of the mountain wilderness for a generation. When the audio finally played through the high-fidelity studio monitors, the room was plunged into a suffocating, freezing silence. The tape did not contain a confession, nor did it contain the frantic panic of 2 brothers fleeing a crime scene. Instead, it was a crisp, clear, and perfectly articulated conversation recorded inside their shared Pioneer Square apartment, a vocal document that completely inverted the fundamental narrative upon which both brothers had been prosecuted, sentenced, and buried. The police came by the print shop today, the voice on the tape stated, a voice that possessed the exact, terrifyingly identical resonance shared by both twins, making it impossible for the computer algorithms to determine which brother was speaking. They spoke to me as you. They looked at the ring on my right hand, they verified the alibi at the warehouse, and they didn't look at the knee. The switch was seamless. The second voice, laughing softly with a terrifying, rhythmic cadence, replied, "They are looking for a singular monster, brother. They are searching for the hand that held the blade, completely blind to the fact that the blade was guided by both of us. You held her arms down while I took her breath, and tomorrow, you will be the innocent accountant while I become the broken drifter. We are the perfect alibi because we are the executioner." The realization hit the cold case task force like a physical blow, tearing through the hard-fought closure they had presented to the Vance family and the American legal system. The entire foundation of the 2026 and 2028 trials, the absolute belief that Thomas was the sole physical killer while Arthur was merely the brilliant, protective architect of the cover-up, was a final, monumental deception. The twins had not split their identities to hide one guilty man. They had split their identities to conceal the horrific reality that both were active, equal participants in the physical execution of Evelyn Vance. They had weaponized the legal system's fundamental need for a single perpetrator, intentionally dividing the physical acts of the murder between them so that neither brother's individual profile could ever be cleanly isolated by standard investigative logic. It was an ultimate, sadistic masterclass in criminal synchronization that had successfully defied the complete machinery of justice until their very deaths. The public was never notified of the tape's existence. The King County Prosecutor's Office, in consultation with federal authorities, made the executive decision to permanently classify the audio file, realizing that exposing the absolute depth of the twins' final victory would cause an irreparable, catastrophic collapse of public confidence in the judicial and forensic systems. The Pendleton Ledger was officially closed, the public narrative maintained its clean, sterile resolution, and the stones marking the graves of Evelyn and Melissa Vance remained undisturbed in their quiet valley. But for the small circle of investigators who carried the secret of the microcassette, the city of Seattle became a permanent, chilling monument to a mystery that had never truly been solved. As the eternal, drumming rain continues to wash over the concrete streets of Pioneer Square, the dark waters of Puget Sound carry the final, silent echo of the twin paradox, a chilling reminder that beneath the modern glass towers and the high-tech illusions of the metropolis, some secrets are engineered so flawlessly that they will remain buried in the freezing dark forever. The classification of the final microcassette did not ease the quiet psychological torment of the 3 remaining detectives who had listened to its rhythmic, mocking cadence. For these men, the official closure of the Pendleton Ledger was not a shield. It was a gag order that forced them to carry a monumental lie into their retirement. The city of Seattle continued to move forward. Its tech-driven infrastructure hummed beneath the eternal gray skies, and millions of citizens walked the rain-slicked concrete of Pioneer Square entirely oblivious to the fact that the definitive narrative of the twin paradox murder was an immaculate fiction. The legal system had stamped the file as solved, the politicians had taken credit for the historic forensic breakthrough, and the public had consumed the clean, redemptive tale of modern science conquering ancient evil. But inside the dark, private offices of the retired task force, the digital copies of the final tape remained an open, radioactive wound that refused to heal. As the year 2026 entered its twilight months, a retired senior homicide investigator named Marcus Vance, who, by a cruel twist of genealogical history, shared a distant ancestry with the victims, found himself unable to survive the cognitive dissonance of the classified truth. Marcus knew that the state had buried the tape to protect the absolute sanctity of the judicial apparatus, but he also knew that leaving the true nature of the Pendleton entity hidden allowed the brothers' ultimate philosophical victory to remain unchallenged in the dark. Working from a secure, air-gapped terminal in his isolated cabin near the foothills of the Cascade Mountains, Marcus began a meticulous, unauthorized forensic audit of the entire post-1991 timeline, looking not for legal evidence to present to a court that no longer cared, but for the answer to a deeper, more terrifying riddle: if the twins had operated as a single, synchronized executioner in 1991 and 1997, how many other cold case files across the continent were secretly missing pages from the exact same book? Marcus deployed a highly specialized behavioral pattern analysis algorithm against the national database of unresolved violent crimes spanning the years 1992 to 2025. He bypassed standard search parameters like geographic location or specific DNA profiles, which the twins had systematically compromised, and instead focused entirely on the structural anomalies of the investigations themselves. He searched for cases marked by a highly specific, recurring pathology, brutal, high-precision homicides where the initial prime suspect possessed a genetically identical sibling, an impenetrable alibi built on shifting witness reports, or an inexplicable, sudden total BTAC in the prosecutorial grand jury process due to an inability to individualize reasonable doubt. The results that began to render on Marcus's high-definition monitors in the dead of winter were a spectacular, heart-stopping revelation of human failure. The algorithm didn't just find a few overlapping data points, it traced a silent, nationwide highway of absolute deception. From the sun-bleached suburbs of Phoenix to the dense, industrial corridors of Chicago, the algorithm flagged 14 distinct, high-profile cold cases that featured the exact, unmistakable signature of the Pendleton synchronization. In every single instance, a vibrant young life had been abruptly, violently extinguished in a secure environment without forced entry, followed immediately by a chaotic legal circus where a pair of identical twins traded places, scrambled the investigative notes, and left the local homicide units completely paralyzed until the statute of limitations, or the degradation of evidence, forced the files into the permanent dark. The realization crushed Marcus's remaining faith in the structural integrity of the law. Arthur and Thomas had not merely committed two isolated acts of violence in the Pacific Northwest. They had spent their entire adult lives traveling the country as a touring company of psychological terror, using their shared biology as a master key to commit perfect murders with absolute, structural impunity. The secret financial pipeline that the task force had discovered in 2028, the twice-yearly $5,000 deposits from Arthur's Bellevue account into Thomas's coastal Oregon ledger, took on a far more monstrous meaning when viewed through the lens of this multi-state highway of blood. The cash payments weren't hush money to maintain an estrangement. They were the dividend payouts of an ongoing, highly profitable criminal corporation. Arthur, utilizing his pristine corporate credentials and mathematical brilliant mind, managed the logistics, the travel itineraries, the clean banking trails, and the high-tech asset protection strategies, while Thomas acted as the rugged, transient scout who embedded himself within the remote wilderness areas and industrial zones to select their targets. The argument overheard by the neighbor in late 1991 wasn't the end of their partnership. It was the birth of their operational manual. The moment they realized that to survive the dawning era of modern forensics, they had to appear to the world as bitter, estranged enemies who could never stand to occupy the same room, while secretly remaining perfectly synchronized in the dark. Marcus sat back from his terminal as the final data array completed its rendering, the pale blue light of the monitor reflecting off his weathered face. The rain was hitting his cabin roof with a steady, deafening roar, a sound that had followed him from the alleys of Pioneer Square to the heights of Mount Hood. He knew that if he released these findings to the media, the resulting institutional collapse would be absolute. 14 separate jurisdictions would be forced to admit that they had been systematically mocked by two men who were already dead and buried in state ground. The legal system possessed no mechanism to prosecute ghosts, and the victims' families would be plunged into a fresh, chaotic loop of unresolvable agony. Marcus slowly reached out his hand, his fingers hovering over the delete command on his keyboard, realizing that the ultimate tragedy of the twin paradox was its absolute permanency. The science of the present day had broken the cell walls, but the twins had already written their final rewrite of history, leaving the true scale of their violence to remain forever frozen beneath the gray mist, an eternal, mocking phantom that the law was simply too weak to ever truly bring into the light. The deletion of the unified data array from Marcus Vance's terminal did not destroy the physical architecture of the truth. It merely forced the final act of the Pendleton ledger back into the analog dark where it had been born. In the early spring of 2026, as the persistent, icy drizzle of the Pacific Northwest continued to coat the modern glass towers of downtown Seattle, Marcus realized that his self-imposed silence was its own form of complicity. He could not alter the legal status of 14 closed cold cases across the continental United States, nor could he force the King County Prosecutor's Office to unseal the radioactive microcassette tape that proved both brothers had held the blade. But he possessed one final, dangerous asset, the physical key to Arthur Pendleton's private, off-grid storage locker, a secure, steel-reinforced vault tucked away inside an industrial warehouse near the heavy shipping docks of the port of Tacoma. The locker had been rented under a deep, white-collar corporate alias that had completely bypassed the asset forfeiture sweeps of the 2026 trials, a phantom piece of real estate that held the last unredacted physical remnants of the twin entity. The journey to the Tacoma docks was undertaken in the absolute dead of night, the black waters of Commencement Bay churning violently under a low, storm-choked sky. Marcus drove through the industrial sprawl, his headlights cutting through the dense wall of fog and sea spray, his mind focused entirely on the heavy brass key resting in his coat pocket. The warehouse was a monolithic, rusted structure of corrugated iron, filled with the echoing groans of shipping cranes and the distant, rhythmic horn blasts of container ships arriving from the Pacific Rim. When Marcus finally located Locker 419, The padlocks were covered in a thick layer of industrial grease and sea salt, untouched by human hands since the winter before Arthur's sudden arrest. As the heavy steel rolling door groaned upward, the interior lights flickering to life, the smell hit Marcus instantly. Not the copper stench of fresh blood, but the dry, chemical odor of preservation, the distinct preservation scent of a meticulously curated archive. The locker was organized with the same terrifying, surgical precision that Arthur had applied to his corporate accounting ledgers in Bellevue. There were no chaotic piles of evidence or scattered belongings. Instead, 3 massive, military-grade aluminum transit cases sat in the center of the concrete floor, surrounded by rows